Okay, we're reconvening after the lunch session, and we do have a 1:30 p.m. timed item, and that's agenda item number 6E, discussion and possible action regarding recommendations of the Cannabis Cultivation Ad Hoc Committee. This is sponsored by the Ad Hoc, Supervisors McCowan and Haschek, and I'd like to go to Supervisor Haschek to introduce the item, please.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. We've gone through a lengthy process with this ad hoc, and just Supervisor McCowan and I did town hall meetings in Covelo, Willits, and Fort Bragg. We've had several staff meetings. We went to Mitchell Creek and met with residents on both sides of the issue on that over there. We've had phone conferences and lots of email input into the recommendations that we're proposing today. And certainly there are recommendations, but there's also some discussion items that we didn't come to an opinion on. And there's also some suggestions for future research. So with that, I'll pass it back to the chair.
Supervisor McCowan?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I did want to make reference to the memos that are online. So the first memo is the primary one from the ad hoc committee that contains our recommendations, and as indicated, that's broken down into different sections, some referencing previous board direction, then our specific recommendations. There are then a couple of discussion items presented without recommendation, and as mentioned, some items for further research. We also reference some specific areas where we thought it made sense to stay with the ordinance. We included those because they've been items of quite a bit of comment and discussion. So that's the first memo, is the primary ad hoc recommendations for the cultivation ordinance. Then we have a secondary memo, and that refers to a staff request for clarification on the county tree removal policy. So there's several questions that have come up as staff has reviewed applications and worked to apply the tree removal policy that is laid out in 10A17, the cultivation ordinance. And there were areas of ambiguity. Staff sought direction. The ad hoc has included this memo and some background information and has given our recommendations. Of course, like all the rest of it, it's up for board discussion. And then there is what is called revised ad hoc memo as of 5/13/19, and that's actually an update to the secondary memo. And the only change in language is the fourth bullet point under the ad hoc recommendations, which was inadvertently left off, and then a minor formatting of putting those ad hoc recommendations into a bullet point format. So other than that last bullet point from the ad hoc, the secondary memo and the revised memo, both dealing with tree removal, are the same. And then I just wanted to mention the recommendation for an extension of the sunset for properties in proximity to the coastal zone, obviously controversial with many people. The recommendation that's being made does only apply in proximity to the coastal zone. The reason that Supervisor Haschek and I felt that was justified is that with the entire coastal zone being off limits to commercial permits, we believe that there has been a limited opportunity for relocation and limited areas outside of those areas where there are relocation opportunities. So we felt an extension of time was warranted. On the major discussion items, if those are something that the board wants to entertain, I believe there are conditions that could be applied, that could be given with direction to staff, that would limit what are perceived as some of the negatives of moving forward with those. But again, that'll all be part of the public and the board discussion, and I'm sure we'll all have more to say as we go forward. And Supervisor, with the consent of the chair, Supervisor Haschek may want to add some additional specific comments, not sure.
Absolutely. Supervisor?
Well, I'd like to thank everyone for showing up today, and I look forward to this discussion. So that's about it.
Okay, ad hoc, I'm going to rely on you in leading us through. Do we have any board comment so far? Supervisor Williams?
When it's appropriate, I'd like to hear the definition of proximity to coastal.
Thank you. That did come up, and in my mind, it's a fairly narrow band. It might be 5 miles or 10 miles inland from the coast or the coastal commission boundary. Of course, the coastal commission boundary varies. It can be up to 7 miles inland, perhaps. So if this is a recommendation that the board is interested in pursuing, I believe it would be appropriate to refer the item back to staff for them to make a recommendation. We have professional planning staff that's more versed in the nuances of what the implications are of setting a line in one place as opposed to another. But primarily it's intended to be in close proximity to the coastal zone, defined as not more than 10 miles inland from the coastal zone boundary. And potentially it could be less. There's some logic to having a fixed distance, so there's, possibly a clearer delineation. But again, I would be willing to rely on staff recommendation on to define that phrase.
Okay, what document,
Well,
are you open to all? Do we want to go through each one? And
yeah, and I think possibly what I might recommend is we do go generally item by item, or at least category, for instance, the previous board direction, and then we could just see is there board consensus or a majority, and items that they're not, of course, would be dropped out. If items do have majority support, we would keep those in and then ultimately give final direction to staff. And with all of these, as you can see, there's no final language here. There's no introduction of any ordinance amendments. If the board supports any particular recommendations, we would give direction to staff to return with ordinance amendments at a future board meeting.
okay, would you like to start with the memo and, which was number 1?
Certainly. So previous board direction, and this was back in November. It was a different configuration of the board, but staff has also considered these items. These were ones that initially took a little more research or thought. Other recommendations from that time were already incorporated into an ordinance update. Definition of license types, that the need for aligning with the state appears to have been more based on our definitions do differ somewhat from the state, and that was creating problems in interpretation of the ordinance. I believe staff input is that the state has come to better understand our definitions and reconcile it with the state language, and it's staff's recommendation that that's not a priority at this time.
Okay,
Generators, staff would recommend an extension of time for the phase-out that is currently included in the ordinance, and potentially that might be up to 2 years. But again, it's I think we're trying to keep people in the process, and rather than create another enforcement area for staff to deal with, it makes more sense to extend out that deadline.
Supervisor Haschak.
Yeah, I think one of the other recommendations for generators would be looking at alternative types rather than just fossil fuel generators. So some of the ones that use bio gas or whatever, and what is it called?
Biofuel.
Biodiesel. And yeah, so there's alternatives that aren't using the fossil fuel, and that was one of the considerations from my understanding in the original phasing out of the generators.
Okay, Supervisor Williams.
Did the ad hoc touch on the noise from generators? Is there any way to do a phase out of the louder generators first?
There are noise standards in the ordinance that people have to comply with.
And was it the ad hoc's recommendation that those are adequate as is, that's working for us?
Well, I believe they were originally based on staff recommendations for standard noise level requirements, but I would go maybe to Deputy County Counsel Kudrowski, if I may.
Absolutely.
Deputy County Counsel Matthew Kudrowski, if I'm correct, we relied on the general plan noise standards in the ordinance for all noises being created as part of a cultivation site.
And then the suggestion of Supervisor Haschak that alternative fuel types could be considered as something that can certainly be considered in the future. I don't think that we need to try to write that in now. But as we approach that deadline, we could come up with those alternatives, I believe.
Okay, tiered nursery permits.
Rather than a tiered system, staff is recommending reducing the minimum acreage from 10 acres to 5 acres. That's been generally popular. There are comments, including, I believe, in the letter from Jed Davis today, that advocating for a tiered nursery. So currently, with a nursery permit, 22,000 square feet, the suggestion is we could allow for a lower level, maybe 2,500 square feet, and then reduce the acreage requirement significantly. So that's been suggested by the public. As of now, the ad hoc's not taken a position on that, but we'll probably hear comment from the public.
Okay, moving forward, industrial zoning.
The table of zoning and permit types does allow for mixed light, does currently allow for mixed light in industrial zoning. And the recommendation is that if we were to continue to allow that, it would only be in a greenhouse with odor control. And then this kind of gets us back into the permit type definitions, and is a greenhouse indoors or mixed light, and but the primary push here is to allow more types in industrial, but with greater odor control. Many industrial areas are in proximity to residential. We do have some permits that have been issued and some that are in process. If the board does want to proceed with requiring only in greenhouses and with odor control, it would probably be equitable to grandfather in those that are already in the process. So don't know if we've clarified board, and maybe we want to hear from the public before the board gives its final position.
Well, just trying to go through and
Okay, I'll try and
have
speed it up a little.
have a process before we go to public comment
Okay.
of what's on the table, and so cleanup language.
I believe staff has identified a number of minor ordinance amendments that would conform to state law or improve internal consistency, and so I think you know, we can expect to see some of that when the ordinance comes back.
Sure. Supervisor Williams.
Could we define odor control? How much of an effort is meant there? A greenhouse with odor control could be a lot of things.
I would go to staff, but I think we already have odor control applications in some instances, so they would just apply that same standard, I believe.
So that's been working, no changes recommended.
If I may, through the chair, Sean Connell, Cannabis Program Manager, no supervisor at this point. There's no changes. I think it's being looked at through our building department, and I would definitely want to refer to Mike Oliphant, our chief building official, for any recommendations on that front.
Phase 3 use permits, again, the board with a previous configuration gave direction that Phase 3 applications be subject to use permits. If the board still supports that, we would ask staff to return with specific recommendations, including there may be some instances where they think a use permit may not be required based on objective conditions that would be identified, so that's a bit open. And the requirement for use permits would satisfy any CEQA concerns that may otherwise be raised. And I think would, for the applicants, may potentially simplify their requirements for showing adequate water. Phase 3 start date, we're recommending a delay until 6/30/2020, partly because of the need to develop the use permit process and get that fully approved through the Planning Commission and the board. If that happens earlier, the board could then consider moving the start date up, but otherwise it would be deferred to 6/30/2020. The ad hoc is recommending transferability not only in rangeland, forest land, and timber production zones, but also in other districts where cultivation is allowed for Phase 1 applicants.
Supervisor Williams.
How would the exception for transferability in the sunset zones allow a cultivator in a sunset zone to relocate? Don't we want to be encouraging that now rather than having them wait for Phase 3 in 6/30/2020?
A cultivator in a sunset zone can relocate anytime. And in fact, the transferability, it's recommended that would not apply to a sunset cultivator, but they could transfer.
Without any proof of prior cultivation on new parcel?
Well, no, they still have to have the proof of prior, but if they're in a sunset zone, they're applying for a permit, they have proof of prior, they can transfer to any other eligible location.
Okay.
So that, this would not affect that.
Supervisor Jurdy.
I just want to agree with Supervisor McCowan that there may be some confusion in the public about this point, but actually if someone in the sunset zone, they've always have the ability to transfer their development site, cultivation site to another parcel. They've always had that ability if they can find another parcel in an appropriate zoning district. I did have one point though on the transferabilities. We want to make sure that I hope the board is not intending to create a loophole, and I don't think that's the intent here, but I think we want to be sure that if a cultivation site has taxes owed to the county and those taxes are not paid and the property is sold, i.e. transferred to somebody else, that that new buyer would be obligated to pay the taxes owed by that cultivation site as a part of their application process. We would not want to create a loophole, I believe, that would allow someone to not pay their taxes, sell their site, and then the new applicant says, well, that was someone else's bill, I'm not obligated, and now I'm going to proceed and cultivate on this site without paying the taxes owed. So I just hope that we're going to clarify that we're not creating a loophole there.
Well,
Yes.
property taxes clearly go with the land, but the cultivation
lien.
tax may be a different story unless we specifically wrote it into the cultivation tax ordinance. So I think that's a legal and procedural question that we could certainly give direction to get an answer to. I agree with you, we don't want to create a loophole, but, one other point with the reason to allow, quote, transferability for cultivators who are in zoning districts other than rangeland, forest land, and timber production zone is so that that new owner can retain the Phase 1 setbacks. Because in Phase 3, although anyone could apply for a particular site, they would be subject to double the current setbacks. With transferability, a current cultivator could sell their property to a new cultivator, and that new cultivator could retain the same setback. And this is important because it may not be feasible to move an established garden to comply with the setback. It could create more ecological impact than retaining the already existing site. So that's one of the benefits of extending it to other zoning districts. The ad hoc, as previously mentioned, recommends an extension of the sunset period for indoor cultivation sites within proximity to the coastal zone. And I see that we may not have specifically included it here, but I believe the intention is also that all of those sunset cultivators would need to apply for a use permit. So currently, if you're 500 square feet or below, I think you don't need a use permit. Another aspect of this, people who are currently applying to be approved, those who have been issued use permits, that use permit may expire May 4th, 2020. So in order to benefit from this proposed extension, they would also have to have a use permit that approved of that. So if they've already been permitted, they're going to have to apply for another use permit. If they're in the process, they might be able to amend it. That'll be, staff determination on that. Live scan, the state requires live scan for the applicant, owner, or licensee. The county standard is every employee must be live scanned. The ad hoc did meet with a number of people on this. We did have communications with the district attorney. He does believe it's important that every employee be subject to an initial background check, but believes a more informal system at lower cost than LiveScan can be implemented. So they have their own extensive database. They can, if they have the birth date, driver's license, name, etc., of an applicant or an employee, they can verify that person's identity to the DA's satisfaction in most cases. He wants to retain the option to require LiveScan. And then we have heard also that some people may prefer the LiveScan rather than the DA's informal review. So we would allow that option if someone prefers that.
Supervisor Aschek?
And also, just to add into that, the ad hoc's recommendation is that that would only be 1 year. That would be for an initial, and that after that, they would be able to work. And the only live scan that would be needed would be the state's annual live scan.
For the owner, applicant, or licensee.
Right.
And other employees, it would be one time only in Mendocino County.
Right. And we've also talked about having that, once they go through that live scan or the interview, then that would be acceptable in various work sites. So.
Correct. And then major discussion points, rangeland. We, the ad hoc recommends the board discuss the issue. We know it's very controversial. And so we're going to hear a lot from the public on that, I'm sure. This would also require a use permit if it were to be allowed. And one of the objections I believe we hear is that this could lead to a proliferation of visual impacts from hoop houses and greenhouses. There's concern about impacts to oak woodlands and other sensitive habitats. However, our ordinance does already prohibit tree removal. It requires adoption of an oak woodland protection ordinance prior to phase 3, potentially another reason to delay phase 3 a bit. So if the board did want to consider new permits in rangeland, the board could also consider limitations, such as perhaps only to other previously cultivated areas, could potentially limit hoop houses and greenhouses. So that'll be board discussion. Likewise, permit size. There are many in the industry who are very concerned about allowing anyone to increase their permit size. They believe that this would create competition for them, and also that it could dilute the quality of the product, thereby impairing the Mendocino County brand. On the other hand, there are others who are able to scale up, prepared to do so, and who believe it's actually essential in order to be competitive in the statewide market. They point out competition isn't within Mendocino County, it really is statewide, and that without the ability to produce more product within the county, it impairs the ability to brand Mendocino County because less product will be available, less product will be on the shelves, and that by scaling up, increasing production for those who are able to do so, it would also benefit the small cultivator by creating brand identity for Mendocino County, which would help the small cultivators find their niche in the market. So again, we'll hear many competing arguments on scaling up and going beyond 10,000 square feet. We are recommending that cooperatives be an item for further study. I think the board's several times voiced support for a cooperative approach, and I believe we're in favor of anything that we could do that would further that effort. Permits per entity, there's a lot of different business models out there with very complicated relationships between a corporation and cultivators who have one or more types of arrangements with them. And the question was, do some of these agreements result in more of an employer-employee relationship where multiple permits are actually all tied back to one entity? And I think more research is needed to understand the interrelationships of some of these permits. And it may be that forming very close alliances with a parent corporation might be the pathway for a legacy cultivator to be able to survive in the market. So potentially there may be ordinance amendments that would be appropriate at some point, or it may just be a case of interpretation. So more to be determined there. Tree removal. Staff, and here we give a bit of background that we do have a prohibition on tree removal. We've cited, and thank you, Deputy County Counsel Matt Kudrowski, for the specific code sections that refer to tree removal. And then staff has posed a series of questions. We have some situations where a parcel has multiple developed cultivation sites. Tree removal may have been associated with only one of those sites. The ad hoc recommends that in that event, the other sites that did not involve tree removal would still be eligible and a permit could still be issued. but they could not be allowed to grow where they had engaged in tree removal. The question is posed, if there is a pre-existing 3-acre conversion permit from CAL FIRE, but the trees were removed after the May 4th, 2017 deadline that is cited in 10A 170902, is cultivation allowed? And the ad hoc is recommending that because the tree removal occurred after May 4th, they could not cultivate within the bounds of that 3-acre conversion. If there are other locations on the parcel outside of that 3-acre conversion, cultivation would be allowed. They have also asked the question, if a cultivation permit is denied due to tree removal, should a future property owner be rendered ineligible from cultivating on that site based on the prior tree removal? And the ad hoc is recommending yes, otherwise it could create a situation where I buy property, I clear trees, I am not approved for cultivation, I sell the property to my brother who then moves forward with the cultivation permit. So prohibiting people from engaging in that kind of gamesmanship, I would call it. And there could be other situations besides, an intentional scenario like I described. But we're recommending that illegal tree removal would render a site ineligible for future owners. Finally, there's the case of the cultivation site itself may not have involved tree removal, but there might have been tree removal to create or improve an access road to that site. And the ad hoc is recommending that in that case, the tree removal was associated with the cannabis cultivation and therefore renders that site ineligible. Again, if there were another site where that did not involve tree removal, that could still go forward. So.
Okay. Any other comments, board members? Supervisor Haschak?
Not at this moment.
Okay, we are going to go to public comment. Mark, please. And following Mark will be Kim Thrill, I think it is.
Thank you. My name is Mark Thies. This may be a little redundant because I was addressing the generator issue and recommending that there's a protocol or regulation for decibel levels and sound pollution. I'd like to be clear about that. Is that in place at this point? That there is a protocol for that? Is that correct? Okay, so it is pretty redundant then, because I was just pushing for that because it's not just generators, it's water pumps, and it's a big industry, and there's bound to be noise pollution in many different levels. Somebody doesn't have hoop houses, has 10,000 square foot of automated, and they've got a bunch of fans. But, okay, it's been addressed. I am curious, what is the decimal level? Do you, for that, and is it in regards to setback?
Please just make your statements, make it to the chair, and we can get some feedback after
Okay.
testimony.
Okay, I'm done. It was redundant. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So, Kim, okay. Followed by Monique Ramirez, I believe that is.
Good afternoon. Thank you to supervisors and the ad hoc committee for all your work on this. And I'm here representing 3 farms in Redwood Valley, Mendo Valley Farms, Mendo Valley Farm South, and Lizard Rock in support of the transferability issue. Thank you.
So Monique will be followed by Joshua Keats.
Good afternoon, Monique Ramirez, District 3. I'm really excited today for this discussion. We've been waiting a long time for some of these recommendations to come before the board for adoption or some sort of action, so I'm really grateful that we're having this discussion. I did send a letter yesterday. Hopefully you guys were able to review it. So I'm just going to go down the list of items that I do not support for the recommendations. The first one is delaying the opening of Phase 3 until June 30th of 2020. I think that this date should be delayed until all of the current applicants have been fully processed and approved. As of April 22nd, the Department of Planning and Building Service Cultivation Report indicated that only 250 applicants have been issued and approved for a license out of the current 1,210 applicants. That means that over 79% of our applicants are still waiting to be issued or approved for an annual permit or a renewal of their permit in this county program. With the trending time frame for a permit to be approved, I strongly urge the board to please extend this delay until we reach at least 85% issued or approved, or at the very least until 2021. I also would like to see that the discussion about the or actually you guys are going to keep the retained setbacks or the acreage allowance for recreational cultivation, that you have to have a 10-acre minimum, and I really believe that we should allow everyone to grow their 6 plants on at least 1 acre or more in this county. I'd also like to see the reduction in the setback from schools from 1,000 feet to 600 to mirror the state regulations. Although this may not impact many cultivators, we don't know what changes will be made to this ordinance in the future, and it seems that it would take 1 second to change the number from 1,000 to 600 feet on the schematic. This is not an unreasonable request, since it would mirror our state regulations, which are commonly stricter than county policy. Not every person in the accommodation zones needs an AP to move forward with their permit, so this justification that they already have to get an AP anyways, in some cases may not pertain. We should just require, or we should remove the 1,000-foot setback, especially because we are moving away from a prohibition mentality, and there are many liquor stores and bars located within 1,000 feet of a school in many areas throughout our county currently. One could argue this poses a safety threat to nearby schools, and yet is currently allowed. And I would also like to see a 2,500 square foot tiered nursery permit for those wanting to do a cottage level, and I thank you for your opportunity to review all of this, and I also want to just say I am so in favor of transferability, which I'm sure you guys know. Thank you.
Joshua Keats, and please be ready. Will be followed by Ron Edwards.
Hello, Chair Brown and members of the board. My name is Joshua Keats. I've been a resident and cannabis farmer here in Mendocino for over 13 years. I'm also the founder and operator of Henry's Original. We're one of the top 10 best-selling flower brands in the state of California. We also only source flower from Mendocino County. We source our flower from over 30 small farms here in Mendocino, and we employ over 60 people from our community at our facilities in Laytonville. I appreciate the county's efforts in continuing to find solutions that will work for small family farms, and I would like to express my support for all the ad hoc's recommendations. Most importantly, I'm here to voice my strong support for increased cultivation limits. I feel there is a misconception by many people that the farmers in Mendocino are just competing against each other. The truth is that what we are all competing against is the 7-acre Humboldt cultivations, the unlimited license caps per parcel in Santa Barbara County, Monterey County, and the desert counties. There is massive cultivation. Mendocino County's largest license is micro-sized in comparison to these. At 10,000 square feet, my state license reads small. By increasing square footage in Mendocino, we are not creating the flood of production that will wipe out the small farmer. We are allowing our farmers to be competitive with the flood that is already coming from other counties. If we want to continue to promote Mendocino County as a region with a rich history, a legacy of cultivation, we need to produce enough Mendocino cannabis to contend with other regions. We will see deregulation of interstate commerce coming shortly. By 2023, the state plans to lift all square footage limits on cultivation. If we want to prepare for both the national and global economy that is coming, we need to begin now. A small farmer will not be able to scale overnight. We need to be ready for the coming changes in the industry by taking steps proactively. We need to allow those that can scale to scale. Companies like Henry's Original, like Flocana, like Payne's Distribution will be there to support all our farmers, big and small, and take their product to market. As a county, we need to produce more to remain competitive. We have a saying at our company The high tide raises all ships. By allowing greater cultivation, we allow the heritage and legacy and the demand of Mendocino County cannabis to grow. As a county, we aren't producing enough yet to properly tell our story as cultivators, our story as a region. We need to be prepared to meet the immediate increase in consumer demand and new dispensaries coming online this year. We need to be prepared for deregulation in interstate commerce and even global commerce that will come. We need to allow our farmers that have the means to scale now, because scaling and development takes a long time. Those that can scale now will pave the way and create the demand for those that cannot scale today. All Mendocino farmers will benefit from the regional identity promoted by competitors. We have to take our blinders off and recognize that we are simply not producing anywhere near enough cannabis in Mendocino to contend with other producer counties, and without increased production, we don't have a story to tell. Again, the high tide raises all ships. If the board would grant me another minute, I'd like to explain the fundamental economics to everyone in this room.
Sir, your time is up.
Thank you.
Ron Edwards, followed by Doug Weston.
Ron Edwards Willits. I just wanted to pick off on what Josh was saying about the larger scale farms, is that some of these larger operations are well organized and are able to, when the tax bill comes, just write the check and send that in. And I think that would take the pressure off of some of the smaller cultivators and the program itself. So I think that's a very important one. On the transferability, have we set the categories of what that is? In other words, if someone has withdrawn their application, are they able to get in the transferability? If they're in process, so I think if we could define those areas of what qualifies as transferability to be clear, so we don't have a misunderstanding on that. I'm in real support of the ability for an employee to get into the live scan and be able to move. Most states that do have cultivation have some type of cultivation card. In Oregon, it's an OLCC card. In Colorado, it is a metric card that you can go to any employer once you've been scanned into the system. Tiered nursery, I'm really backing that one, and I think that we should also, the reason for tiering is not so much just an extended level, but also it should be taxed at a different level. So if somebody's doing a 2,500 square foot nursery, they should have a lower tax burden than somebody doing a 22,000, 5,000, or 10,000 square foot nursery. I would like to, I did not hear it in the ad hoc, and a lot of the things we've talked about is the readout of the program. And I think it would be helpful, since we're going to be reducing the meetings, if there would be a printed or something in that the cannabis program could put out that would say, these permits have been issued, and the reason that these are held up is because, is it a CDFW reason? Is it a water board issue? So that the public and the board would know what is really going on with the holdup in the permits. It wouldn't need to be a verbal presentation, but I think a printed report of changes and so forth that are going on. Rangeland, I hope that we realize in this county that we do not have clearly defined zoning areas. In other words, it's not like we have rangeland over here, this is TPZ. The way the zoning is mixed up is you have rangeland mixed throughout lots of areas, so it should be understood that we're not just saying all hillsides, because rangeland can be down in the valley limits. Thank you very much.
Doug Weston, followed by Judy Tichinen.
Board, thank you for this opportunity to speak. My name's Doug Weston. I live in Franklin Road in the Mitchell Creek area. I'm opposed to the commercial growing of cannabis in this RR2 residential zone. Just the designation of commercial cannabis should tell you that it needs to be located in a commercially zoned area or maybe even ag. When you apply for a permit for a building project or subdivision, you're required to submit applications, fees, wait for approval before you start. This seems to be backwards. You apply and you just start growing, or you've been growing already. No approval is necessary. No water well testing, no groundwater testing for chemical leaching, no environmental impact studies. According to the grower at the Casper meetings that I attended, the growers meetings, they claim to only use 15 gallons of water per square foot per day. Based on the maximum square footage of 2,500 square feet per grower, that would be 37,500 gallons per grower times the 10 permits, 375,000 gallons of water per day. That's a lot of water. Okay, now that water has to go someplace. It goes back into the ground. that tainted water goes back into our water supply. That's just in our Franklin, or in our Mitchell Creek area. That says nothing to say about the air pollution, the stink that comes from these fans that blows out of these buildings that we have to put up with. Being a business, aren't they required to be ADA compliant and do these other testings? Why do our elected officials seem so bent on supporting these 10 growers who are basically illegal at this point? Why don't they listen to the 90% of those who voted against the commercial cannabis in this area on their survey, your survey that we paid for tax dollars, instead of the 10% who are elected supervisors? Are they working for them, or are they working for the majority of the people, would be my question. Instead of extending the sunset for 2 years longer, legally they should be shut down now until everything is permitted or put in the right context. Supervisor McCowan, thank you for your prompt response to my letter this week. I don't believe it's yours or my responsibility to help relocate people who are out of compliance, and so taking advantage of the local residents in that area. A use permit for these growers would just be another way of allowing commercial enterprise to exist in a residential area. It sure looks like a couple of you are working pretty hard to make this happen instead of upholding the zoning as it is written currently. Thank you.
Thank you. Judy Titchenen, followed by Mark Bivens.
Hi, my name is Judy Titchenen. I live in the Simpson Lane, Mitchell Creek. Oh. Want me to start over?
Yes,
Okay.
please.
My name is Judy Titchenen. I live in the Simpson Lane, Mitchell Creek community on the coast, and I have for almost 40 years. You know where our community stands on the issue of commercial cannabis cultivation in our residential neighborhoods. The response to the county-sponsored survey on the overlay proposal was 90% opposed. There is a false narrative being spread that we did not know what we are voting on, but numerous neighbors here worked on a robust grassroots campaign to inform our neighbors of the issues prior to the survey. A local activist group sent out a mailer to every address in our community. People canvassed their neighborhoods, phone trees were set up, and at least 3 local websites were disseminating information with links to the county's official website. I personally moderated a community meeting using the county consultant's official handout as the content of our discussion. 75 neighbors, including growers, were there and participated in this discussion. This community wants our residential neighborhoods to remain residential. We have been waiting for the sunset date at which time commercial operations in our R2 zones would be prohibited. Many people continue to contact us with questions and concerns about commercial cannabis cultivation here. To a person, they refer to the survey results and state that they think this proof of overwhelming opposition should have settled the issue. We are dismayed at the new recommendation of the Cannabis Cultivation Ad Hoc Committee to extend the sunset date for commercial cannabis cultivators in our residential community specifically. We do not agree that what happens here should be tied to what happens in the coastal zone. Who knows how long that process will take in the coastal zone? I understand that the county has hired a consultant who is now working on a coastal zone ordinance for commercial cannabis cultivation. Most people would agree that it is only fair to extend the sunset within this zone, since they have had no guidelines as of yet. But growers in our zone were given 3 years from the adoption of the Mendocino Cannabis Cultivation Ordinance, the MCCO, to transition to permitted zones. I fail to understand the ad hoc assertion that there was somehow a lack of awareness of the need to do so. At a Board of Supervisors meeting last year, one of the supervisors asked county staff if people submitting permit applications were aware of the sunset date. The answer was a definite yes. The community of Simpson Lane, Mitchell Creek, and the MCCO both have a goal of moving commercial operations out of this residential zone. Any extension not tied to a specific required action towards relocation is unacceptable. Extending the sunset by 2 years without making any other changes accomplishes nothing. We support ideas or compromises that help these growers transition. For instance, we absolutely support the idea of transferability of permits to new locations for
Please.
growers course, caught in these RR2 zones. I have one sentence left.
Okay, quick.
But 2 additional years of the status quo is not acceptable.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mark Bivens, followed by Paul Hansberry.
Good afternoon. My name is Mark Bibbins. I've been a resident of the Hills of Home Lane for 40 years. My wife and I are both very strongly opposed to the idea of extending the sunset date for 2 years. Thank you very much.
Paul Hansberry, followed by Hannah Nelson.
Good afternoon, Paul Hansberry. First of all, I want to apologize if I offended anyone this morning with my misinterpretation or misunderstanding of Robert's rules. I wanted to talk about the cultivation tax and the minimum tax as it applies. If there is a crop failure, or if you're only cultivating, say 500 feet, but the smallest license you can get is for 2,500 square feet, and that's what the minimum tax is based on. There are people that only grow that much. I'm one of them. With the ability to scale up as your business grows. So just a flat tax based on gross receipts would be far more desirable. There's an appeal process that's written into the tax law, but that appeal process hasn't happened yet. I understand that they're working on different scenarios that would be appealable. I would recommend that maybe those scenarios would be automatic exemptions to streamline the appeal process, because the very nature of having an appeal is unusual or special circumstances, not a laundry list of appealable items. I'd like to talk about hoop houses as temporary shelters versus a structure. I'd like to put a moratorium on permitting for hoop houses until we get a clearer definition. The structure, the cloche or the cold frame, is just a temporary structure. If something can be taken down in less than a day, it's not a structure and shouldn't require a building permit. The transferability, I think, is a very important piece. People will put hundreds of thousands, if not millions in some cases, into their compliance, and if they're not going to be able to make it for one reason or another, they should be able to recoup some of the losses or some of the input that they put in to get the equity back out of their properties. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Hannah. And Hannah will be followed by Casey O'Neill.
Good afternoon, Hannah Nelson. I'm going to work my way backwards from my memo because I always start in the beginning and I run out of time. On the tree removal, I just raised a few questions, and that's it. You could look at my memo. I just raised a few questions. Cooperatives, I really strongly support this recommendation and really want to see us do everything that we can to build that infrastructure in ways that make sense in terms of focusing people on shared resources. Rangeland, in my memo, I cut and paste our use ordinance, our zoning ordinance and the uses to give an example of some of the allowable uses that are currently existing. And I make the argument that while, of course, we need to consider and balance the mitigated negative declaration that we relied on, that in some ways there could be the argument that by funneling people through a permitting process on rangeland, it gives greater protection to those resource lands. I do understand that it is a controversial issue, and at one point Casey had suggested for some of these more controversial issues to have a facilitated dialogue with the community. So I just wanted to remind people of that. With respect to social equity programs, there was just a recent update since I even wrote my memo, and that is that the governor has a trailer bill and has issued his proposed budget. Of course, things can happen, but there was a big push towards social equity programs, and I believe that the language that he used if it doesn't get modified, would place us well in terms of being eligible for such funding. And I have many years of prior litigation support documents that would help us for that eligibility. Really quickly, live scan. I think I've been raising this issue for 3 years now, and I've written in the memo why I think that it's unnecessary to live scan employees, and I hope that you seriously consider that. And with respect to the start date of Phase 3, I raised the issue of social justice for renters. I just hope that you could consider an exception if you are delaying that. Tiered nursery permits, I think, are very important. And I also mentioned just briefly, kind of if it ain't broke, don't fix it with respect to the hoop houses on industrial zoning. One thing that I failed to mention is, in addition to having a smell ordinance, a smell requirement as part of our ordinance already, and wanting to funnel people to appropriate industrial lands, I forgot to mention the energy use issue, so that's the other thing to consider. And then finally, generators. I think that's a ripe issue for a targeted task force, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Hannah. Casey O'Neill, followed by Alan. I think it's Harris, but it's Alan at lighthouse.farm.
Casey O'Neill, local farmer, policy chair for Mendocino Cannabis Alliance. A lot of things to blast through, so I'm going to try and knock them out quick. The letter from Alan Harris noted that the requirement for only two permits per site does not allow for a nursery permit, so I think it would be a pretty simple change to add in that a nursery permit does not affect that 2 cultivation permit, and I think his letter laid that out very well. Definitely want to support Karen Byer's letter in regards to the extended time for the accommodation zone. I think that's really important. Strong support for transferability. Obviously, that's an issue that's been worked on for a long time, and I'm really glad to see it come back. Also, the tiered nursery, specifically and ideally that it would go down to the 2,500 square foot possibility, because a cottage operator could have a very small clone business or a very small seed business that could be a significant monetary income. Extension for generators is definitely a support, and also, again, the consideration around small generator usage in the fall for fans and dehumidifiers and such. I think at some point we're going to need to address that, but I like the idea of extending it and giving us some more time to talk about it. Strong support for equity programs in any way, shape, or form. The association would be thrilled to be able to work on that in partnership with the county. And also cooperatives. From a personal perspective, I've spent a tremendous amount of time working on cooperatives over the last few years, and as a farmer, it becomes very difficult as a group of farmers to have the business management and the staffing needs for cooperative processes. And so some form of institutional support from the county on that could go a very, very long way to helping us realize that process. The live scan for employees, I advocate consistently for normalization of cannabis, and I think the CDFA's requirements around 20% ownership and live scan for all of those owners should meet the standard, and that it would be my advocacy that we remove the live scan for employees. And I would support hoop houses being allowed on industrial parcels. It seems like industrial is kind of the place where all kinds of industrial type activities happen, and so seems like hoop houses would be shouldn't necessarily, unless if there are specific complaints that have been registered, that would be another story, but I think important to dialogue there. And as Hannah noted, one of the thoughts that has occurred to me around the question of expansion is that the only entity that has access to every cultivator at this time is the county. So perhaps the county could send out a survey to all of the applicants in the process to ask what the thoughts are about expansion of cultivation. Like I say, this is a big issue. We have significant opinions on both sides as an association, and we're trying to engage in the dialogue to sort that out. But I think that the county could be very helpful in facilitating that discussion. And I thought there was some great correspondence today, and I think that it's invigorating to see this level of participation from the community, and thank you to the board and staff for all of the time and energy on this issue.
Alan, and Alan will be followed by Jed Davis.
Hello, my name is Alan Harris. I'm from Fort Bragg, California. I've lived on the coast for 18 years. I co-founded Lit House with my brother, Christopher Harris. We're a collection of small cannabis farms located near Fort Bragg that specializes in the cultivation of top-shelf flowers. I'd like to make 3 public comments. First, I'd want to show my support for an extension of cultivation entitlements for coastal indoor cannabis producers that are located in sunset zones. And second, I would like to have more than 2 cultivation permits per parcel. This would allow small businesses the opportunity to remain flexible and nimble and upgrade outdoors to hoops and hoops to real greenhouses, et cetera. We already limited to 10,000 square feet, and I believe it makes sense to allow diversification of cultivation styles. And lastly, I would like to ask the county to consider allowing individuals that are being sunsetted to relocate to all the resource lands, including TPZ, not just rangeland. Thank you.
I have a question for the speaker. In your letter, you also talk about raising the limit to 10,000, or it's limited to 10,000 square feet, therefore limited issuing more than 1 permit or two permits per person. In what zoning districts are you referring to?
All of them. Why? I mean, you're allowed to have 10,000 square feet in 10 acres? Not in R2.
Yeah.
Yes. I'm trying to get out of R2, right?
Yeah. I think you're in TPZ also?
Yes, that's correct, yeah.
So you're saying the limitation of 10,000 square feet in TPZ is something that you would like to see expanded to something more than 10,000?
Not necessarily, no. I think most of the county agrees. Well, not most. I guess we've heard that people would like to have 4 acres, 10 acres. But what I would like to see is having more styles of cultivation allowed on 1 parcel. Like currently, you're allowed 2 permits.
Okay.
It'd be nice to have a nursery, small outdoor. When I say small, I mean cottage specialty outdoor, the tiny ones.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Madam Chair.
Oh, just one moment,
So-
sir.
If I may clarify, the request is to allow more than 2 permits, but if the maximum cultivation amount for that parcel was 10,000, it would still be 10,000, even though a 3rd permit might be allowed on the parcel.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jed Davis, and Jed will be followed by, and I hope this is correct, Dylan McGinty.
Good afternoon, Jed Davis. I'd like to give my support to a lot of the ad hoc recommendations and Hannah Nelson's letter. I thought it was very well put and reasonable. The reason I give my support is because it seems that we're starting to move in a direction of understanding that we want to regulate cannabis like we would any other agricultural crop. Right now it's over-regulated. It's making it very difficult to move through the process. The process is also very uncertain at the state level as well as the county level. So I encourage that we keep that in mind, even extending the sunset for the R2, RR2. Not everybody can move through this process in a timely fashion that we set out 2 years ago. So I feel like there needs to be some leniency, and I'd like to see some directive to the building and planning department and the ag department to look at a case-by-case basis as cultivators go to renew. We may not be able to move through all of the steps of our compliance plan in 1 year. And right now, there's a very rigid interpretation of if you don't meet this, sorry, you got to meet it. Otherwise, you're not going to get to be able to renew your license. And that's fairly unreasonable, considering we've all gone through a lot of different challenges over the last couple of years, and we're all doing our best to get there. So. If we can keep that in mind and be flexible, I'd encourage the board to maybe give a directive to the agencies in our county to have some malleability and some open-mindedness in allowing us to stay in the program and to bring others into the program. That's important. Thank you.
DYLAN, is it Dylan? Yes. Okay, sorry. And he'll be followed by Scott Ward.
How's it going? My name's Dylan McGinty. I'm born and raised in Mendocino County. I'm a farmer, a multiple business owner, and a resident of Mendocino County. And I'm currently part owner in 7 of the separate state cultivation permits. And I'm here to seek expansion of the canopy to be greater than 10,000 square feet. Throughout the year, we have been attending multiple statewide cannabis events where we've had the pleasure of meeting many farmers and cannabis business owners throughout the state. in counties, for example, as Humboldt, Lake, Sonoma, Monterey, Santa Cruz, and further down south. They all currently have a canopy size ranging from 1 acre to 25 acres. As a farmer and a businessman located in Mendocino County, I am already set to lose the long-term race by starting with a limitation that is 1/4 my size of my competitor. The demand for legal cannabis persists, and we are currently not keeping pace with the demand from our distributors. Right now, they are lined up waiting for product that we can't produce. Increasing the cap would not only bring more money in tax revenue to the county, but offer more jobs due to expansion and growth of the business in the cannabis industry, and potentially new businesses coming into the area or working with businesses established here. Last year, our cultivation site paid roughly $30,000 in taxes to the county, and this year we're estimated to pay $50,000. Increasing the cap would see those numbers quadruple in revenue for the county. As farmers, we're always looking to the next year's crop, preparing and trying to expand for the future. Increasing the cap would allow us to start prepping and building the necessary improvements we would need to propel our brands and companies to the commercial level to be successful and compete with the cannabis space. We know a lot of our peers in the cannabis industry here are focused on small farmers and scared of the big business and big money coming into the county and taking over. What we would say would allow the pioneers, the legacy, and the heritage growers with the proof of cultivation to expand our farms so that we're not held back while the rest of the state is expanding and moving forward. Mendocino County's heritage is cannabis. The cannabis industry has always been the financial backbone, and we need to focus on capitalizing on our strengths in the industry. Mendocino County is recognized for producing some of the best cannabis in the world, and we need to be allowed to produce more of it. If you want to see our communities and counties flourish, we need to be embracing the cannabis industry. Furthermore, I have a couple notes just that we agree with the transferability of the permits, and lastly, that we think that the county tax should be based on the net profit, not gross sales. Thank you.
Thank you, Dylan. Scott Ward, followed by Michael Strupp.
Good afternoon, Scott Ward, Redwood Valley. I'd like to thank you guys for your time and effort put in the ad hoc committee. I know that was not an easy chore, and you can't make everybody happy, and I certainly, and I'm sure the rest of us behind me appreciate that, and I appreciate all staff's efforts to date too. So the steep hill we're climbing. And speaking about steep hills, the tree removal, the last portion Mr. McCowan spoke about was including improving existing access roads in the tree removal prohibition. With our legacy program, prior cultivation, you must prove that there's existing roads to those prior cultivation sites. You may not be able to remove any trees. State mandates that you have a lockable building, as does the county, for fertilizer storage. Many people are getting permits for dry sheds and greenhouses and hoop houses. To get those building permits, you have to have CAL FIRE pre-approval to submit your building permit application. With that CAL FIRE pre-approval, they require that the access roads to the building sites meet their standard. Many roads that are existing now to the prior cultivation approved sites do not meet CAL FIRE standards. So there may be requirements to widen the road, make a 50-foot radius, do pullouts, which will require tree removal. So by prohibiting, improving, or fixing an existing access road, and not letting someone take down a tree to make it meet CAL FIRE standards, you're going to put a lot of legacy farmers out of business. They have to be able to fix those roads to get their building permits to store their crop, to grow their crop. And I wish you would reconsider maybe an exception saying, except when modifying an existing road to meet CAL FIRE standards. Thank you.
Okay, Michael, followed by Valerie Edwards.
Hi, Chair, Board, thank you. My name is Michael Strupp, and I'm a cultivator on the Mitchell Creek area, the Mendocino Coast. I was born and raised on the Mendocino Coast and attended school K through 12 there, and I am intent on raising my 2 young children on the Mendocino Coast. I just wanted to thank the supervisors that did come out and saw what they were voting for in terms of the cultivation sites on the coast to see what it is, because it's one thing hearing about what everything is, and it's another thing to come and see it and to really see what you're voting on. I'm very much in support of the extension. It's as a small business owner, it's very nerve-wracking to go to bed every night not wondering if in a year from now you're not going to be able to support your family, your promised jobs to lots of employees, and to know if they're going to be able to support themselves. And I really want to stay on the coast, and you know, we're not allowed to cultivate in commercial areas. There's really nowhere for us to go. So the extension is really gives us a chance to maybe get our feet under ourselves and find a place to move and continue these businesses. We really look forward to having the metrics behind to show the value that we can bring the county, that we can produce a highly desired product that not only increases tax revenue, but jobs on the coast. And you know, we're really hurting. I also own a retail store in the town of Mendocino, and I can tell you that it's down. The money's down. We're struggling to get by, and I know a lot of restaurant owners that are doing the same thing. That it's hard times. You know, we did a little survey of a little economic survey of the 14 coastal growers, and we found that we had created over 71 full-time and part-time jobs just in our little group. And if we were allowed to actually grow into the size of our permits, then we would be able to produce way more jobs. And having this other 2 years is going to allow us to actually show what that looks like. And it feels really good to know that we actually have a second to be able to go. And you know, there's been so much money that we've spent on contractors in order to like come into compliance, hundreds of thousands of dollars that's helped circulate around the county that we've that don't really get noticed, but I know that it's helping out other people and you know, creating more jobs. And there's kind of that bonfire analogy of, you know, if we have a little fire, we can only, you know, warm so many hands around it. But if we can get a big raging fire and make our cannabis industry something really strong here, there's a lot of people that can get warmed from this fire, and there's a lot of benefit that can be seen in not only jobs raised, but taxes created for the county. And I'd really want to stay here in Mendocino County, and I'd love to stay on the coast. And I appreciate your support. Thank you.
Valerie, and then Joe Tolgren will be up next.
Hi, Valerie Edwards, Laytonville area, 3rd District. I would like to speak specifically about the accommodation district. The 10-acre requirement is also required, you know, to cultivate outdoors is also being required in the accommodation. Now, these are small cultivations, you know, these are small sites to begin with. Accommodation districts are allowing outdoor cultivation commercially. Why shouldn't the patients be able to also cultivate outdoors? Indoors is very expensive, and a lot of these patients, you know, are limited. They're low-income people. Also, transferability. You did talk about transferability in other districts, but you didn't exactly say specifically accommodation. The opt-out people, it's tied. Their opt-out is tied to the land. The opt-in right now is tied to the farmer. This is not equitable here. Also, and then the setbacks to the accommodation districts have been reduced to 20 feet to the parcel line. I'd like to also ask that the reduction be set to 40 feet to the house next door also. They've already been reduced. Why not go ahead and reduce that instead of keep it with what the county is already saying? I've been told that, well, you just can go get an administrative permit, but, you know, that's more money again. And I also wanted to talk about, you know, reducing the setbacks to sensitive receptors across the board. I've heard that the staff has said, actually not just recently, but, you know, over the last couple of years, that, you know, well, in this is that, you know, it'll affect only a few people. You know, the 1,000-foot setback is only, you know, would only benefit a few people. Well, I think if a staff person went to a doctor and said, I've got this ailment, and the doctor said, well, come back when you have more people that'll benefit from, you know, what I have to tell you, I think that person would be very concerned that they are important. And so even if that setback affects only one person or two people, that person is as important as everybody else. And so I'd like you to consider that. And also to eliminate the 100 square foot personal use to reflect the state allowance of 6 plants. I know you want to eliminate or at least deter black market diversion, but limiting everybody across the county to 100 square foot in order to try to control these converters or diverters, it penalizes everybody and actually criminalizes people who need to grow more than just 100 square foot. Okay, thank you.
Okay, Joe. Joe will be followed by Marnie.
Hello, my name is Joseph Telgren. I live on a beautiful piece of rangeland parcel in the hills outside of Covelo. I'm here to support in keeping rangeland a viable zone for cannabis businesses. I urge the board to allow for transferability of license. It will only increase the value of my property, so if I must sell down the road, I might be able to recoup some of the finances that I've lost into bringing this property into compliance. I've spent far too much money, sweat, and emotion on this property to see the property go back to normal rangeland parcel or for it to be sold just for ranching. I urge you to see the logic of growing 10,000 square feet or even a full acre of cannabis is far less environmentally detrimental to my 200 acres than the cattle that have roamed these lands for forever in this county. It's sort of a backwards double standard that makes no sense environmentally or otherwise. If we must do a secret report for these cannabis farms, maybe we should also do a secret report to see when all of these cannabis rangeland farms have to go back to raising cattle. What do you think might be more environmentally damaging? I would also like to bring up an issue brought up during one of the last meetings. I believe Brett Schultz, he was complaining that not enough people were coming in to tell him certain problems that they were facing with the program and how to maybe streamline efficiency. I'll just try to give you a little bit of insight. Last week also, Supervisor Williams was talking about perhaps updating your IT department to allow for more online activity. I think that would be a great idea. The ability to apply for applications, to update the myriad of requirements facing applications online would be a great help, but only if there was somebody to review the information. Right now, there are currently, I believe, 3 people on staff in the planning and building department dealing with cannabis permitting program. They're obviously overworked, they're understaffed, and probably underpaid. I think they're doing a great job, they're just overburdened. They are essentially becoming glorified planners. They're flagging questions all day long by people that are coming in the door, that are calling on the phone, and quite frankly, they don't have time to read a single email. I've seen firsthand that their backlog of emails go back 3 to 4 weeks. That alone shows me that that's at least where some of the problem lies with getting permits issued and approved. I've seen that firsthand, that includes me. I would like to also agree with all of Hannah Nelson's comments. I would like to also address the proliferation of hoop houses. You know, I don't necessarily love them either, but I also do believe in the right to grow, and I think an easy solution would be to require some exclusionary tarp to block out light at night. Thank you very much.
Marnie?
I'm Marnie from Covelo. Thank you, ad hoc committee and board. Thanks for hearing us. I'll just jump right in. Regarding the nursery permit, please lower the arbitrary number of acres required from 10 to 5 acres or less to have a permit. And we have 2 parcels, and each has a 5,000 square foot cultivation permit. Since there's a 2 permit cap per entity, we're at maximum. We're unable to get a nursery permit without giving up one of the cultivation permits because of the cap. I'm requesting that you allow growers the freedom of holding 2 permits per parcel as opposed to 2 permits per entity so that we can both breed and cultivate on the same parcel without having to give up a cultivation permit on another parcel. Breeding and seeds and clones and growing are all part of the cultivation process. The imposed minimum tax per parcel, especially at the starting point in the regulated market, is an extreme hardship. And this may sound harsh, but it occurs like a money grab. It's continuing prohibition disguised as the regulated market, and it will slowly eradicate small cannabis growers. Is the minimum tax happening in any other area of agriculture? And how come you have chosen to single out the cannabis growers? Let's wait until the actual statistics come from track and trace, and then make an informed choice and educated decision on what affects our livelihoods. We have to stop the silent attack on growers. Growers are miracle workers. They grow medicine that will heal the world, sacred medicine. I strongly believe that the cannabis realm should be added in the advertising allure of Mendocino. We're literally known for having the best cannabis in the world. Let's embrace the beauty of the world's best cannabis right here in the county. Mendo genetics are sought after worldwide. It's the smell, the taste, the hide, the structure of the bud, the healing that it brings, the love that it's grown with, the climate, the elements, the inputs, the care, and I could go on. But let's be bold from this point on and be proud of the rich cultivation and history in Mendo. One live scan is enough, and live scan for employees should not happen. Growing plants for personal use should be based on the number of plants we grow and not the square footage. Nature doesn't carry a tape measure. Please consider changing the arbitrary 1,000-foot accommodation to 600. It will match California's, and if you can help one small grower, it's worth it. Hoop houses, they've been around since the beginning of growing. Thank you.
Thank you, Marnie. Karen Byers, and she'll be followed by Kathy Monroe. I'm sorry.
That's all right.
I hope I didn't skip one by accident.
All right, so I'm Karen Byers. I live in the 3rd District. I have off and on for most of my adult life. I've been in Mendocino and Humboldt County for the last 30 years and have closely watched and monitored what's been going on in the end of cannabis prohibition. And so I'm really excited to see where we are today. Again, thank you for the opportunity to comment. I'm here to ask that in addition to the ad hoc recommendations that the Board of Supervisors extends the application deadline for the accommodation districts to 1 year, or reflecting July 1st, 2020, in order for a path to develop for an applicant to successfully apply for both this local and state license. Second, I'd like to extend the the cannabis accommodation combining districts, establishing a new accommodation district, to extend that deadline from November 1st to by 6 months, or until May 1st, 2020. I feel like there's not been enough outreach into the community to know of this option, and I'd like to advocate for that as well. When I attended the department's training and workshop in February on accommodation districts, we honestly couldn't sit there and identify how an applicant could make through as the local and the state permit in order to get online this year, because as you know, the temporary permits were phased out by the state on December 31st, and then after that, it only left the provisional or the annual, and provisional was only for someone that had a temporary permit. And the annuals are backlogged, beyond backlogged, so if they really weren't able to actually cultivate until they had their annual, it was just an impossible path. So again, I'm asking for those things to be considered. I brought it up in the Willits ad hoc meeting, but then I had to take some time off. And again, I wasn't clear on how we could do it, and I got to talk really fast because I'm here to talk about the governor's trailer bills, which now will open up provisionals for people that not only temporaries, but for anyone applying. And so a path has been identified where an accommodation district applicant now could also get their state. This is part of the trailer bill, which is the budget portion that will be looked at in the end of of June, and it will be treated as an emergency bill once if the language is passed. And so this is what the state is doing in order to unjam where they're at with all the temporaries about to expire in July. So again, this is an opportunity for us to give our accommodation districts a chance to grow. We've got a lot of invested into it from volunteer things. Anyways, you get it. I wrote y'all an email. Please consider it. Thanks.
Catherine Monroe will be followed by Marty at martywana.com.
Hi, my name is Kathy Monroe, and I guess I'm the representative for the California Native Plant Society. We made lots of comments when you were first developing the cannabis ordinances, and we want to reiterate their concern for rangeland and TPZ and other fragile habitats. So it's a slippery road there, and we want to make sure to preserve those zones. So I have some concern over transferability too, because I thought that the effort was to kind of move cannabis growing to where it would be less harmful environmentally. And then this is kind of more, I just recently saw the movie River of Change, which I thought was incredible in terms of how it showed the impact of the cannabis industry to the millennium-long legacy and heritage we have of steelhead and salmon. I think we have to really be looking at expansion and its possibilities in terms of impact of water resources for what would be an irreplaceable resource if it was lost. And it just seems like it's come close to that. And who knows with climate alterations, what kind of drought years we might still have ahead of us. Fortunately, we're good this year. So
don't leave. I think a supervisor has a
So
question.
it might be unfair to ask you a question to respond on the cuff here, but as far as transferability to rangeland, it's my understanding that some rangeland in Mendocino County has actually historically been used for traditional agriculture, and so there may be an existing farm on some rangelands. And would your group be opposed if there was a transfer of a cannabis cultivation site to a portion of a property that was already in production of traditional agriculture?
I'd have to talk to the group, but I think we'd be open to that. I mean, I think the major thing is alteration of habitat. And if it's been altered already with traditional agriculture, and that may be all right too. But I think we really have to watch out about our water resources with this. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Marty? And Marty will be followed by Elise Planty.
Good afternoon. My name is Marty Klein. I live in Willits. I have a farm in Covelo. I think the biggest current issue right now is figuring out the CEQA issue. Thank you. Figuring out the CEQA issue. Until we figure that out, it's going to cost farmers a ton of money. I'm not totally against expansion, but I don't think we should consider expanding until maybe January 1st, 2023, and on parcels of 20, maybe even 40 acres or more. If we write to the county, I think there should be a response letter or a response email that says you received our letter, thank you, something to that effect, so we know that they're received rather than having to go to the website to make sure that they're received. I think as a county, we also got to decide what kind of county we want to be. If we could look back 50 or 60 years at the county of Napa, they produce about 5 or 6% of the grape haul in California. Excuse me. They account for 50% of the sales of wine grapes in California, and the farmers make 3 or 4 times the money. So I don't think expansion is the right thing for us right now. I think we need to figure out CEQA. I'm under the impression that an individual could hold 2 licenses anyways, so there's plenty of space to grow there. Also, there's it's nice to know that there's companies here that are buying specifically from Mendocino farms, and just Mendocino farms. There are other corporations in Mendocino that are not doing that. So I like that I heard that Henry's Original is actually buying only from Mendocino farms. There's also about 400 or 500 farms that have not paid any taxes. So if each one of those farms is growing 200 or 400 pounds, there's still 100 to 200,000 pounds of material that these farms that want to expand and these companies that want to expand could buy from. As more farms are coming online, that material is going to get into the regulated market. I think there's plenty of material. It's just being sold in the wrong market. I think that's about it. Thank you all for this process. Appreciate it.
Elise? Jen, you're up next. Fokasi?
Hi, thank you very much, staff and supervisors, for all the work you do. I'm really proud to live here and be a part of this community and excited to see how this grows and changes and meets the needs of
Your
local
name
farmers.
for the record. I'm
sorry, my name is Elise Planty. So I'm a resident of Covelo. I'm the financial and compliance manager for our family farm. I also teach Spanish at our local high school. I came up here to comment in support of transferability and also to express my disappointment in what I understood to be a late announcement of the ability to file appeals for the minimum tax. While our family has a 10,000 square foot permit, we were unable to cultivate our maximum grow last year. And this just gives you an idea of a scenario that could happen. My mom passed away in November, and we ruined a lot of our crop when my husband and I went down to South San Francisco Bay to be present for that. Not to mention, neither the state nor the county were able to fully process our permits. This isn't a critique per se, it's just a reality that I want you to know that we're facing. And other, people have situations similar to ours. Much product has had to be stored of the product that we did, that we were able to keep until we can sell with integrity and approved permits. We took my high school teacher's salary to pay our minimum tax because we deeply care about continuing in this business. I spoke in depth with employees at the tax collector window about our compromised situation and was offered no reassurance that I wouldn't accrue fees if I waited to pay. $5,000 is already a lot of money, so we went ahead and paid, like I said, with my teacher's salary. I would like to remind the board that this type of late addition to a heavy financial requirement really hurts us in our ability to move forward. I hope that a reasonable process will be held for appeals and that people who paid out of, fear that they would accrue more fees or lose their viability as a business will be allowed refunds. I will add that I definitely support taxes based on sales only. And if there's something I don't understand, I'd love to learn more, Thank you for all the work that you guys do. Thank you.
Jen?
Hello, Jen Procacci, District 3. I'm speaking in the strongest support of transferability as both a permitted cultivator on rangeland who has invested so much in my business and my land, and also as a member of the working group that focused on that issue. So thank you to the board for bringing that recommendation forward today. I'm also in support of delaying phase 3.
So they can revisit them, the opportunity to come back to us with what they think is reasonable based on parcel size, scaled down nursery size, and the zoning district it would be in.
Okay. I'm odd woman out, but okay. It appears there's 4 that agreed to.
No, three.
Three. Oh, okay. All right, thank you. Okay, does staff understand then? Okay.
Staff understands. We'll review implementation of a tiered nursery system on parcels between 2 to 5 acres in size and bring it back for the board at a later date.
Industrial zoning. Supervisor Williams?
I would support this recommendation.
Okay. Okay, we're having an internet issue, trying to get back online. Got it? Okay. Supervisor McCowan?
And the issue that comes up is currently mixed light permits are allowed in industrial. We do have a couple of applications have been approved. We have some in process. So if we do require that they be only in a greenhouse with odor control, is that something we want to allow them to phase into, or do we want to grandfather them in? But also, I would go to staff, this may be an issue where we had a difference between the state and the local definitions of mixed light. Because if it's in a greenhouse with odor control, but it's fully contained within a greenhouse, is that still mixed light? Under our ordinance, it might be. Under the state, maybe not. So is there any one from staff who can illuminate that topic?
Deputy County Counsel Matthew Kudrowski, I have 2 points on that. I talked a bit with Sean Connell earlier, and one of the discrepancies on this cottage issue and what's allowed in industrial is that mixed light, I believe, is allowed during phase 1, but phase 2 is more specific to just indoor zones. So I don't know that the mixed light applications we're talking about are phase 2. It could be phase 1 applications. I'm not sure Sean and I have had a chance to go through that to see if there is a need to grandfather or not. In terms of the state definitions, that is one of the issues that pops up. Now, under the state definitions, mixed light would be if you're adding artificial light. Our definitions weren't like that, so we've been more specific throughout on what the structure is. Our indoor definition is very thorough in terms of what the structure must be. So that's where the issue of requiring it to be in greenhouses, which I imagine we're looking at as being more sturdy than a hoop house, means that it's something different from mixed light versus indoor or outdoor.
Supervisor Williams?
Yeah, so mixed light or supplemental lighting makes sense to encourage because more photons means more growth, but not necessarily more growth per kilowatt of power. So so you want to use as much outdoor light as possible and augment it, ideally with spectral control, in order to keep the carbon footprint as low and keep the yield as high per unit of energy. So I want to make sure that we're trying to encourage mixed lighting as opposed to pure indoor lighting wherever possible.
Well, Supervisor McCowan?
Well, I think the wherever possible might be the issue because, again, many residential zones are close to, many industrial zones are in proximity to residential. But since these are being billed as staff recommendations, I would go to staff to state what their current position is on this recommendation. I think we are willing to allow cottage indoor in industrial. I mean, that's pretty simple. On the next issue of mixed light in industrial, but only in greenhouses and with odor control, is that something staff would support, or do they support a different approach, if we may?
Yes.
If I may, through the chair, Sean Connell, Cannabis Program Manager. Staff is in support of this recommendation.
Okay. Supervisor.
So rephrase, anywhere indoor lighting is allowed, I would like to make sure we also allow mixed lighting. We don't want mixed lighting to ever be more restrictive than indoor.
I guess I don't see any disagreement with that. Staff,
Well,
do you
So I think staff
has a problem?
with the,
Mixed light.
well, staff is supporting this recommendation. Is not supporting or is?
Madam Chair, Sean Connell, Cannabis Program Manager. There's no unsupport from the, we're just trying to understand and process what Supervisor Williams
so
is saying.
staff-
But we're in support of this recommendation.
Staff
Okay.
supports this recommendation as written.
Correct.
And in that regard, in this instance, we would be more restrictive on mixed light.
Yeah, so I guess what I'm proposing is that we strike the but until the end of the sentence.
Well, that's not the recommendation.
Well, why would you allow indoor, I'm sorry if I may through the chair.
Got it.
Why would you allow indoor lighting without the odor control, but that if you have mixed lighting, you suddenly need odor control? You're making it more
burdensome to lower your carbon footprint and use the available ambient light.
I think indoor already requires odor control.
Well, if that's the case, and we're talking greenhouses, it's already indoor. It seems duplicative to have the but only in greenhouses with odor control. You're saying that's already the case.
Mixed light is a different definition than indoor. I think staff understands, so everybody's going to need odor control for industrial if it's indoor or greenhouse.
Sean Connell, Cannabis Program Manager, that is correct. At this point, we're looking for guidance from this board so that way that we can make these determinations as we process these applications. And that's really why we're here, is to take your guidance so that way that we can enforce these regulations as you see fit.
So I'd like staff's opinion. If we strike but only in greenhouses, not hoop houses, and with odor control, will it have the same effect? Because a greenhouse is already a structure that would require the odor control.
At this point, we'll take this back and I can bring that response back to you, sir.
Well, if I may, greenhouse does not meet the definition of indoor as defined in our ordinance, which is very specific. So if we want odor control for a greenhouse, we have to say so. And Deputy County Counsel Kudrowski, is that accurate?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
So we have a very specific definition of indoor. A greenhouse would not meet the definition of indoor unless it had all these very specific building requirements.
I believe that's correct, given how specific it is about studs and distances between them. I might also look to Sean Connell, who worked in building before.
And I got to say, in my world, the state's already made this decision for us. The state and many jurisdictions fully support ramping up major indoor. Former Governor Brown turned a blind eye to the greenhouse gas implications of that, and everyone thought this was a great way to go, partly because it's easier to control and measure and tax when it's produced indoor, I think. In my world, it would all be outdoor, but that's not the world that we're competing in.
I support the staff recommendation, which is clearly saying it's a greenhouse, it's not a hoop house, and with odor control.
And that would be at least 3.
Okay. Yes. Supervisor Haschek?
Yeah, I'm in agreement too, and I agree with what Supervisor Williams is saying, but I think reading this, it's kind of lays out that there needs to be odor control in the cottage indoor and in the greenhouse. So I'm fine with the recommendation.
Okay, staff, on those bullet points, we're okay? Yes.
Deputy County Counsel, just to confirm for the first bullet point, was there board consensus on not doing the definitions at this time?
I believe so, yes. Okay, moving on to staff recommended cleanup language. Staff's recommendation for minor ordinance amendments that conform to state law, improve internal consistency, or simplify administration of the ordinance. I do, with the cleanup language.
Yeah, would this include the 1,000 to 600 feet change to fall into line with state law?
I have no idea.
Sean Connell, Cannabis Program Manager. No, this would not address the setback.
Supervisor McCowan?
I believe this is not intended to allow for any substantive change unless it's something that state law has already created the change, and we need to follow suit to conform our ordinance to the state. And other than that, it would just be minor cleanups for clarification or continuity.
And that's the way I read it, and I'm in support of that. Supervisor McCowan? Okay. Supervisor Williams?
I support it.
Okay. Is that clear then? Let's move on to ad hoc recommendations. for ordinance amendments. Let's go to the first one, Phase 3 use permits. Supervisor Hascheck.
Yes, I've heard a couple issues brought up about the Phase 3 use permits and the extension. Well, we're not to the extension yet. But anyway, you know, there are so many applicants out there, and it just seems like we do, if there is some way of extending the start date of Phase 3 till we can get a handle on these applicants, it just seems like that would be the practical way to go forward. And I don't know how to do it, and I know we've talked a lot about it, and
Supervisor McCowan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, these are our recommendations, so,
yeah.
you know, the assumption ought to be that we are supporting these, and again, starting with the use permit issue, if we could take that before we take the extension. Again, a previous board supported use permits. It was a differently configured board. We've got a couple of new members here. And, you know, I think in staff's view, this really simplifies how Phase 3 is applied if we develop a use permit process. And again, potentially, depending on what staff brings back to us, there could be some exceptions. Maybe if someone is zoned ag and there's no issue with water, you know, if there's some objective criteria that satisfy the requirements of the ordinance, maybe not everybody needs a use permit, but basically the default position would be Phase 3, you're applying for a use permit.
Supervisor Jordy.
I support Supervisor McCowan's summary of the way it should proceed.
I support.
Supervisor Williams.
I support the Phase 3 use permits.
Okay. Phase 3 start date. Supervisor Williams.
I have some concern here because I understand the motivation for pushing it back. We have a whole lot in the queue. I've heard public comment that we should wait until all of the current phase permits are processed. I've also heard 85% might be a reasonable threshold. I feel like if we do that, we're not talking about pushing it back to 6/30/2020. It'll be a lot longer. I don't see these moving through the state process anytime soon.
12/25.
Exactly. So, and I've also heard from staff that Phase 3 may have a slightly different effect than Phase 1. And I'm really curious to see how these Phase 3 permits sail through the process. Will it be any different than what we've experienced to date? And I think the sooner we have that data point, I hear laughing, as soon as we have that data point, the better. If we get some Phase 3s in and we show the state, this is the same hang up we have now. It's just we have a much greater backlog. I'd rather start addressing that sooner than later. I think kicking it down the road isn't really saving us much. Mm-hmm. Now, if staff is completely burdened with the current, I mean, I see 2 or 3 moving through per month. And so can I ask staff, is staff time 100% consumed? Looking at the rate these are being processed, are we just spinning our wheels?
Sean Connell, Cannabis Program Manager. At this point, I do want to remind you that I do have a 30% staffing, so I do have staffing woes that do elongate these review processes. However, once this program is at fully staffed, I believe that we will be able to process these in accordance with our ordinance. At this point, we are a little hamstrung due to our staff requirements.
Right. So what I'm getting at is I've heard that the Phase 1 permits are held up with the state. And so I'm thinking if they're held up with the state, could we start working on the Phase 3? Or are the Phase 1 really held up with us? In which case we need the staff time and we should hold off on Phase 3.
Well, we've got some discussion and we have other comment. Supervisor Jordy.
The county ordinance does not allow cultivation or other activities in as many districts in phase 3 as it allowed in phase 1. So by its very nature, it'll be slightly less complicated and fewer parcels that are even up for application. Alternately, you hear at least whispers in the corridors outside of the meetings that there are multiple reasons for the permits not being finalized. In the meetings, we're being told, oh, it's the bureaucracy that's stopping it. Outside the room, we're hearing some applicants don't really they want to be in that permit application process. They don't really want to actually finalize their permits. What we will find out if we open up phase 3 is, because we're talking about new people, perhaps better capitalized, they may be moving through faster because they want to get their permit. So I think we should not postpone it more than 6/30/2020.
Supervisor McCowan?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And this was a point of discussion in the meetings that the ad hoc held with staff, and I believe that at some point I was advocating delay phase 3 to the end of the year, to 12/30/20 roughly, and I believe staff position was that they thought a delay until 6/30/20 was reasonable, again, primarily to allow for development of the use permit process for phase 3, and that use permit process may well make it easier not only for staff to administer the ordinance, but for applicants to navigate it. Because currently, without a use permit and with the other requirements related to water availability, it could be more challenging for applicants. That's my recollection of some of the discussion, and we might go to staff for their opinion regarding is a delay until 6/30/2020 reasonable, or what would they prefer?
Staff?
Deputy County Counsel Matthew Kudrowski, and looking at the delay until 6/30/2020, from my recollection, that was in part just to make sure the use permit process was in place by that point in time. I envision that being at least one meeting with the Board of Supervisors to review a staff proposal for what use permits look like before undertaking what's probably some kind of a CEQA review of that. I mean, it's going to be, depending on what else we're talking about for if Rangeland goes forward or not, we'll have to look to see what doing these things to phase 3 means. That being said, in addition to what we're talking about, phase 3 and use permits, really, it's all manner of use permits. If there's a lesser permit, like an administrative permit or a minor use permit, I think that's all, it's all discretionary. And that's the key thing that we're looking for, is being able to have additional discretion on a permit that could make life a lot easier looking at each application. Part of the issue with the current system has been a very robust ministerial permit, which means we have to make sure all our boxes are checked. And that's, so looking for discretion gives us some more wiggle room to actually make things hopefully go faster with that.
Supervisor Haschek?
I think one of the things we talked about too is that if we postponed it till extended phase 3, the start of phase 3 until 6/30/2020, is that it would give the existing legacy growers another year of time before the new growers came on. So I think that was a consideration that we talked about.
Okay, very quickly.
Additionally, it would give staff more time to address the backlog as those applicants move through. I think it would be unreasonable to set a standard like we can't start phase 3 until everyone in phase 1 has been approved, because we ultimately don't have control of that when it comes to the state process.
Supervisor Williams?
I'd still like an answer to my question. If we're held up on the state, what is staff currently occupied with in regards to phase 1 applications? And I mean in a genuine sense, because it would seem to me if we're blocked on fish and wildlife on water, eventually there's nothing for us to do. And if we're at 30% right now, when we more than triple to 100%, we fill the positions that are open. Can't those additional resources be doing something towards phase 3?
If I may, through the chair, Sean Connell, Cannabis Program Manager. I think that's a two-part question. And so I want to address the first part first. We have 1,400 applicants that are being processed by a team of 5 people for the last 2 years. So that is definitely a portion of why it has taken so long to do that review. We have a very large application pool under phase 1. By allowing us this extension to provide the process for phase 3 that new applicants would come in, we get the opportunity to take lessons learned from the initial process and apply those into phase 3 under the different paradigm of it being a discretionary permit type. So there's a bisection there that needs to be thought about all the way through. The other portion is that, yes, I do agree that by providing us this length of time, we get to address the process while continuing to train my staff to get through the current amount of stuff that is in our workspace. It's over 1,400 applications that we are constantly trying to get through. That requires us coordinating with the community to make sure that those applicants are providing us the information as they receive it from state agencies on a timely manner so that we can process those permits accordingly. By moving this forward in phase 3 and having an established protocol and educating the public on what the expectations are, we will be able to move those permits much faster than what we've done here. And I'm going to defer to Director Schultz.
Madam Chair, could I just address Supervisor Williams on this issue? I really appreciate the discussion about, you know, these 960 that are in the queue that we brought, and I brought those up at the last meeting. I really don't think we're going to work on those, and I'm going to work on those with Sean. I'd really like to get your comments on the phase 3 start date. Can we go to 6/30/2020? I'd recommend we do that. And
I support it. Supervisor Haschek?
Yes.
Supervisor Jurdy? Supervisor?
I would support it if we could get an understanding of whether the current permits are blocked on us or the state. To date, we've heard where it's blocked on the state, but now I'm hearing that staff can't do phase 3 because the workload of phase 1. It sounds like it's blocked on us.
If I could address the board again on that
Yes,
issue.
sir.
Brent Schultz, Planning and Building Director. We will get to those units there, those permit applications in that process. Right now, I'd prefer not to discuss that issue. I prefer to get direction on these points. And I can get that information together. I can meet with you individually on those. But I'm not prepared right now with Sean to address that question. So if we could just stick with the memo and what the ad hoc wanted to do, I'd really appreciate if we could do that.
Okay, thank you. And that will get us through, or we're going to be all over the place. So I think you, on the start date for phase 3, I think you have direction. Transferability in RL, FL, and TPZ. Supervisors? Supervisor Haschek?
Yes, I'm in support of it.
Supervisor Jurdy?
Yeah, I'd support the transferability, yeah.
Supervisor McCowan?
Yes.
Supervisor Williams?
Yes.
You have 4 yeses. Transferability and other zoning districts? Supervisor Williams?
Yes.
Supervisor McCowan?
Yes.
Supervisor Jurdy?
Yes, but clarification, except for sunset zonings and
Yes.
I want to toss out an idea in reverse, that if someone has a permit that's expiring in a sunset district, would there be the ability for them to sell their permit to someone who is in an area that is not sunsetted?
So,
To someone to relocate elsewhere, basically.
Supervisor Haschek?
Well, they can relocate now. The person who is in the sunset zone can relocate.
With their permit.
Yeah, I would toss out the idea of if they didn't have the capital to relocate, if they could sell their permit to someone who could move to some other
Against the law.
location.
Against state law. Supervisor Haschek?
Yes, and it was also brought up about accommodation zones, so we might discuss that too.
Yeah, I would prefer to take that up as a separate discussion. So first of all, we've already said okay to Rangeland. Now we're looking at the other zoning districts? No, I guess we're still on Rangeland, Forest Land, and TPZ.
No, we've passed that.
Okay, good. Yeah, so we're
We
into
are
the-
on transferability in other
Exactly.
zoning districts.
And so
And we're
in-
voting on it as we speak,
Correct. So I
unofficially.
obviously support this, but I do not support transferability in sunset zones or accommodation districts. And if we're going to consider those, I'd rather do it separately from the primary recommendation.
Well, this is all we're considering right now is the language that's here. And I can support it, and I put a double line under except in sunset zones.
Yep, I agree.
Okay. Limited extension of sunset period. I have an absolute no. Supervisor Williams?
I have a concern that if these cultivators start on the permitting process today for a new property, that they may not get through the process in time. And I'd like to understand what the ad hoc had in mind in regards to ensuring that they'll be able to make the transition by this proposed date, if not sooner.
Supervisor McCowan?
The recommendation is that they would either have to be permitted or in the permitting process, and they would have to acquire a use permit. They would be indoor only. And I would also, because people have had 2 years to come forward and get legal, and if they haven't come forward in that period of time, I would not allow the opportunity for an extension to anyone who has not submitted a completed application as of today. I don't know if that answered your question.
Well,
but
a completed application for a new location, somewhere they're moving to out of the sunset?
they would, to me, I mean, if they don't have an application on file, you know, they've just been gaming the system.
So, clarification, that's not what I'm getting at. Say, Mitchell Creek cultivator, if we give them this extension, can they relocate to another property and get through the permitting process?
Well,
the rate I see it, the queue progressing, I worry that in that time period, they won't be permitted.
People are not being denied because the process takes time. People are being denied because they're no longer cooperating or they voluntarily withdraw. Anyone in the sunset zone, and that'd be the ideal solution, any of the cultivators who have received a permit or applying for a permit in a sunset zone may transfer to any acceptable transfer destination. And this doesn't change that. As soon as they can transfer out of there and have a location to go to, they can do that. And it's not a question of do they have time. You know, it's more a question, do they have a location to go to, I think. So on the last day of the sunset, whether that's as it is now or through the extension, the last day of the sunset, they could be applying to transfer, I believe. And I would go to staff to confirm that as.
Hello, Siobhan Holmes, Plain Building Services. I think we're using the word transfer when we actually want to use the word relocate.
Correct.
Okay. That's very important.
Good point.
So I think the other thing to keep in mind, if you are a current cultivator and you will be seeking relocation, if you move midway through your process, you have to get a new water board permit. You have to get new permits from Fish and Wildlife. So there are components of your whole operation that have to start over.
But they're allowed to do it.
Yes.
Supervisor Haschak?
Yeah, I think part of this has to do with, future opportunities, the cannabis enterprise zones, and some of those things that might be happening. We don't know what's going to happen or when that might happen, but that's kind of our Supervisor McCowan and my thinking that those might be opportunities for these people in the future. It was a hard decision to make this recommendation, but we looked at the time it has taken to get permits for these people, and just thinking that this was a fair way to go forward. And certainly, if we do accept this 2-year extension, that's it. For me, I'm not going to extend it anymore, but that's what I'm thinking.
Supervisor Jordy?
I'm not in favor of extending the extension or the sunset. The residents made it very clear that they were not wanting commercial activity in their zoning district, and I want to respect the opinion of the residents there. I am supportive of finding other locations, and we've talked about them for the last several years. I'm more inclined to think we could find a way to allow expansion of existing cultivation sites in zoning districts where it's allowed, then we are likely to find the the perfect site, which will require an EIR for a big major cannabis cultivation zone on the coast. I think that's perhaps offering a false hope to people that that's going to happen. And certainly it's going to be a 3 to 5 year process, not a 1 to 2 year process. So I think that's why I'm offering up other ideas, like allowing people to relocate to the ag parcels in the coastal zone, or allow people to relocate to an existing TPZ or forest land cultivation site outside the coastal zone. I think those are more likely to move ahead quickly than to find an industrial site someplace or semi-industrial site anytime soon.
Okay, Supervisor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, I think we may have 2 in favor of the limited extension and 2 opposed, and it's going to come down to Supervisor Williams, I believe.
Well, I think what I would like to see is, I would like to see both camps feel like we have a plan to locate the current RR2 cultivation facilities to a more appropriate and larger parcel where they can grow and flourish. And I don't think that simply giving the extension alone is providing that pathway. I think Supervisor Jordy has some good ideas about making exceptions as far as, if we were told them tomorrow you can go out and start looking at ag and coastal, and we want you to make that transition, and we're going to special case this. I think that opens a pathway, and that's just one idea. Are there any other ideas on the table?
I just offered a second one also to allow the expansion of TPZ and FL existing cultivation sites.
Yeah, so do any of for the ad hoc, since you met with a number of the RR2 cultivators, what was your sense on their eagerness to move, and did they have any ideas that would allow us to help with the transition? I'm looking for a compromise.
Supervisor McCowan?
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is, in my mind, a compromise. So I think the cultivators, particularly some who have made considerable investment in infrastructure, would like to stay where they are. But they understand that, giving them additional time is making a concession to them. And again, it's based primarily on the fact that because the coastal zone, the entire coastal zone has been off limits, because we don't have an ordinance that applies there that would allow them to apply for a commercial permit, their relocation opportunities were limited. Supervisor Haschek said we don't know what the future may bring, and so the ideas that are being discussed, even if we said yes to every one of them, we don't know if they would come to fruition by 6/30 of 2022. But that is our recommendation. It does give people who have been operating in good faith to come into compliance with a very extensive list of requirements and dealing with all the state agencies. The cost of compliance is high. And one interesting thing, when we met with the neighbors, and if you drive around the neighborhood, it's pretty obvious that the only cultivators in this neighborhood are not ones who have applied for permits. There's obviously people who are cultivating who have not applied for permits. They're not being inspected. They're not known to be in compliance with any of the requirements. The people who are in the program who have applied for permits are under very stringent requirements for proving where their water came from, for dealing with wastewater, for dealing with pollution issues. One operation that we viewed, all of their wash water from cleaning the floor or rinsing out the pots that they're cultivating in is stored in a separate tank that is then pumped out by a commercial service that then hauls it off-site and disposes of it properly. I don't think the same can be said for people who are not in the permitting process. When that issue was raised, it was very curious that there was such an adamant stance against allowing the permitted growers to continue when the issue of unpermitted growers following no regulations, no inspection was raised. The comment was, well, we're not snitches. So unpermitted growers, we're not going to say anything. The permitted ones, they got to go. So it's a complicated issue. As Supervisor Haschek said, it was a difficult recommendation to make. We came down in the belief that these folks are entitled to more time to attempt to find an alternate location. I'm with Supervisor Haschek. This extension would be a hard deadline, but you know, it's the will of the board.
Is there any commitment from the board to continue brainstorming and trying to assist with that transition? And it would be for the residential community so that they could reduce the amount of cultivation sooner than this deadline, and for the cultivators so that they wouldn't be stuck in a hardship resulting from them coming forward and trying to be part of the legal market. I mean, what I see is the ones that have stepped up and tried to comply are the ones that are being booted.
And I believe that's what justifies a limited extension for a limited area. And I think the ad hoc states their commitment to looking at other options when we say we further recommend the county actively pursue adoption of cannabis enterprise zones. I would also be open to a version of Supervisor Jurdy's suggestion that this limited group of permitted cultivators who might benefit from the extension if the board approves it. So it's this limited universe of folks that are, in my view, already in the pipeline. To me, this isn't for somebody that comes in tomorrow and says, gee, I want to apply now. But if they're already in the process as of today, I would be open to allowing them to relocate potentially to a forest land or timber production zone location subject to a use permit.
Can we give that to staff as a recommendation to work on as part of this item?
And then that'd have to be part of the CEQA review as well, naturally. But, you know, again, we're talking about 10 to a dozen permits. I think we're still 2 to 2.
Now, are you willing to tie this item with the with staff looking into transition options?
I think I just said that.
Okay, then it's 3 to 2. I agree.
Okay.
If that's all right with
3-2.
Supervisor Haschek.
Yeah, I think we can look into it.
Okay, well, but it says here, when it talks about extension of sunset period, are we agreeing no extension?
No, the recommendation is to extend to 6/30/22 for permitted indoor cultivation sites within proximity to the coastal zone, And as discussed earlier, we would ask staff to come back with recommendations on how do we define in proximity to the coastal zone.
So the extension, at this time, 3 have agreed that we have an extension within proximity to the coastal zone of the sunset period. I see later in the same paragraph that the ad hoc does not support the approach of an extension countywide.
Correct.
So which is it?
It's limited only to in proximity to the coastal zone.
I just wanted to get that into the record and understand it, to make sure we were all on the same page. And I don't want to see any extension to the sunset period. So that's a no for me, but I'm on the 3-2 side, losing side, I guess you would say. So, Supervisor.
I would like for us to give staff some more direction about what in proximity means. Earlier, I think I heard 10 miles thrown out. And I think Navarro, Comshy, and Branscombe are all within 10 miles as a crow flies. That seems like a bit excessive when we're talking about coastal. But I understand in the 4th district, coastal is a much different line than the 5th. Can we give some direction?
I think it should be coastal zone.
Well, again, we wouldn't be having this discussion if it was only coastal zone. These are cultivators who are outside of the coastal zone, but in proximity to it, and therefore had limited relocation opportunities. I'm fine with it being a pretty narrow window of what is in proximity, but I would defer to staff to come back. Is that a uniform 5 miles from the coastline? Is it 5 miles from the coastal zone? Is it a geographic feature? Is it a straight line between 2 points? I think staff is qualified to review the issues and come back with a recommendation, but it's intended to create a narrow exception for people in very close proximity to the coastal zone.
Supervisor Hasjack?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I think that we've talked about this kind of at length in our ad hoc committee meetings with staff. And I think staff does have the idea of what would limit it to just that area we're really talking about. And so I feel comfortable with sending it back to staff and having them come back with that recommendation. I just wanted to make sure that on this 3-2 vote that we did include that we were going to direct staff to look at some of those options with forest land and TPZ land for potential sites to relocate.
And if I may, only for people who would benefit from this limited extension.
Correct.
Okay, staff, do you have that down? Are there questions?
No, if I may, through the chair, Jesse Davis, senior planner. So staff has, done a basic review of those applications that are subject to the sunset provisions for residential districts. We identified 13 total indoor cultivation sites that are subject to a zoning restriction. With that being said, 9 of those are currently eligible under the present recommendation of today, which is that they maintain a present use permit or administrative permit for their cultivation activities. So that being said, we have 9. Of those, the median distance to the coast is presently 7.12 miles. It's important to remember that the coastal zone boundary is not a standardized line along the coast, that there are areas, for example, north in Piercy, in which a cultivator may be 7 miles from the coastal zone, but still quite close in all actuality. That being said, the mean of our distance of those identified 13 is closer to 2 to 3 miles, ultimately. So staff presently has prepared a buffer of 5 miles. That being said, the majority of our cultivators do fall within that 5-mile buffer. However, there are exceptions, again, being that the median distance of these cultivators is 7.12 miles. But staff will prepare options and bring them back to the board for further review.
One short comment.
One more clarification, and I do support a use permit for all of these. So even though their initial permit, it might have been 500 square feet, it might have been an AP. Going forward, if they want to benefit from the extension, it requires a use permit, so all the neighbors are clearly on notice and have the opportunity to appear at a public hearing.
Okay, live scan. Ad hoc. Supervisor Williams?
I think it's odd that you can be a county supervisor without a live scan, but to work as an employee in a hoop house, you got to get one.
We do get live scans.
Oh.
It's called the voters.
So in seriousness, I believe we're treating these employees as working for a drug enterprise where in fact they're now in a legal farming business. And we should have the same requirement as employees working at a nursery or at a vineyard. So I would support as least restrictive background check as possible. Not that background checks aren't important, but I think it should be fair across the board.
Supervisor Haschak.
Yeah, one of the things that we found out during this is that the state requires a live scan every year for the annual permit. And the county was requiring the live scan every year for the owners, the applicants, plus all the employees. And so what we're recommending here is that the owner, applicant, licensee gets it for the state every year, and then for the county just the first time. And that's to make sure that we're covering all of our bases according to the district attorney. And that our recommendation is also to go to this lesser type of background check, which could just be identifying oneself to the DA's office for the employees, and that would just be the first time. And we talked about the option of having it be a live scan, but it would only be one time going for, and that would be good for from then on, and possibly having some kind of identification that it could carry over from work site to work site.
Supervisor.
I would, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I would think that the state doing an annual live scan would be sufficient for us. If they have a state permit, it means they pass their background check with the state. Why do we also need to conduct one? We're talking about how to cut the cost of this program for applicants and for the county. This seems like one place where we're just doing two background checks that should yield the exact same results.
Supervisor Haschak, if you have a response.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, according to our conversations with the district attorney, there are different things, different information that comes up through the county's live scan, according to probation and some other information that is derived from that.
Supervisor McCowan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So Supervisor Haschak is correct. It's not exactly the same information because the state does not have a way of checking to see who may be on probation with a cannabis exclusion. Potentially, if that was found out later, it could result in a permit denial. The board amended the cannabis cultivation ordinance, I believe in November, to incorporate a rather robust amendment suggested by the district attorney, and that did require that every employee be live scanned. And I think it's a reasonable compromise between the district attorney's original recommendation and the current ordinance and what is being presented now. And one point of clarification, so I think the district attorney still wants to see the live scan for the owner and the applicant and the licensee on an annual basis. But for the employees, it would be a one-time review. It could be simply by their database, which is quite extensive. They are confident they can positively identify most people through an informal review rather than a live scan. The district attorney suggested potentially a fee of $25 for that as opposed to the $85 for the live scan. And again, for those employees, other than the principals named by the state, it would be a one-time review. So that's a big improvement, I think, in terms of where we are right now. And it does have the district attorney's support, and that's what I also support.
Supervisor Jurdy?
I support the district attorney's request.
I think you have a majority there, but I want to point out, I think this is a prohibitionist mindset. You wouldn't require this background check for someone working at a restaurant serving alcohol. What are we afraid of? The people we should be worried about are the ones out in the national forest.
No, but
right?
in some industries, anytime you go to work,
Yeah.
for a new employee, it does happen. Background checks are done.
But shouldn't there be a rational basis that we're comparing it to another industry, whether it's a nursery or working in the fields
Well,
or serving wine at a restaurant?
May I say something?
Yes, absolutely.
In my district, a really sad incident occurred. And their hoop houses, their greenhouses, everything was raided. And the neighbors were terrorized with what was going on. And so here is this one grower with crop gone, horrific damage to all the buildings. Found out it was an inside job, but they can't do anything because they couldn't find any evidence. So it might benefit a person's business in the long run to know who's going to work for them and whether they've had anything in their background. So that's just my comment. Supervisor Jurdy?
Oh, sorry.
Supervisor Haschak?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Just a point of clarification to Supervisor McCowan. If this is accepted, are we talking about, does the DA want live scans, a county live scan for every applicant, owner, and/or licensee every year, or is that just the initial, because the state would be ongoing?
I believe he may want it every year. I'm happy to have us clarify or staff clarify that with him. If he supports one time only for the owner applicant licensee, I'm fine with that. But I think this is a reasonable compromise from the district attorney's original position, and so I'm willing to clarify that point because it's not clearly stated here, but I'm willing to go with this recommendation with that clarification once made.
Okay, one last bite of the apple.
Okay.
Supervisor.
Yes, I'm in agreement too, but I would certainly like to push for not requiring additional live scans after the initial one at the county level.
So is that,
Well, but we're willing to let it be the DA's call on that one.
I think it has to be. Okay,
Well,
yes.
my
Why
call
is
is
it
to
the-
support the DA.
Why is it the DA's call?
Okay, Supervisor
I
McCowan?
believe the DA, I hope I'm stating this correctly, may be the chief law enforcement officer of the county and has a lot of experience and has been right a number of times calling out major issues at the state level. So, and the fact that the live scans are the way to catch probation requirements that don't show up, or rather the DA's review is a way to catch probation requirements that don't otherwise show up, and things can change in the course of a year. Again, I'm willing to, if the DA thinks one time is enough, that's fine, but I would defer to his judgment on that issue.
Okay, I'd have to agree to that as well.
Already did.
You did. So that's 3-2. Okay. Staff? Okay. Social equity programs. Comment, ad hoc? Supervisor Jury?
I support the ad hoc's recommendation to adopt social equity programs if funding can be obtained to implement those.
Yes.
That's 4. Yes. All right. Issues presented for discussion without recommendation from the ad hoc Rangeland. So, yes.
Chair Brown, excuse me. The social equity programs, we are learning more and more about those programs, and I understand the board's direction on this. But I guess I would like some leeway that as the staff does gain more information on this and we know how much, what the requirements are, how much time this will take, and what the return on investment is, that we could bring that back to the board. I guess I'd like a little gray area here, that if we find that this is not really what we think it is, that the board would agree that we don't move forward. So what I'm saying is you're making a decision based on the information that we have right now.
Right.
It may not be all the pertinent information that's needed to really understand these social equity programs. And I don't know if any of the staff want to add to that.
Okay, well, I'm going to ask Ms. Duquette.
Sarah Duquette, Executive Office. So there is additional dollars in Gavin Newsom's budget, but one thing that has to happen is an equity assessment must take place. After the assessment, that informs the ordinance. Once the ordinance is adopted, it will go to the state, and then we can go from there with funding. So this is going to be a longer process than overnight. So if you wanted to do this, I would really look at that part of the recommendation that says don't use general fund. There will be an opportunity for the county to apply for grants to fund this assessment and to fund the creation of the equity program. Because without that grant funding from the state, it would be a more investment of more general fund dollars. So I would recommend, if this is something you're interested in, to just direct staff to monitor the situation and pursue grant funding to do the equity assessment and the equity program as the first step needed to get the dollars. And I believe there's $10 million that they're going to spend from a different bill, and then $15 million more from the state. And they did include that we can apply to fund the assessment part, because that's going to be a heavy lift, and you might want to look at your options in terms of who does what and what are your options. Because again, we are, the staff is before you. It's the same staff, so.
So supervisors, should we take a step back and we just heard a recommendation, CEO and from staff, which I think is very good, and include that in our directions. Supervisor McCowan?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, I don't see that the current language conflicts with the CEO's request or Deputy CEO Duquette's information. I was going to point out that the governor's budget does include money not only to implement, but to develop a social equity program. So the way it reads now, adopt a program consistent with state legislation if non-general fund money can be identified. If that can't happen, we would not adopt the program. So I don't see that any of this is in conflict. However, if it's easier to accept saying, rather than adopt, to say staff to research a social equity program.
I would prefer that language. Supervisor Haschek?
That's fine with me.
Thank you for the suggestion. I'm not seeing any opposition. So, okay. Now we're on Rangeland. So it comes without a recommendation from the ad hoc. And why does it come without a recommendation? Can I have a response, Supervisor Haschek?
Well, we had different opinions on how to proceed with this, and so that's why we didn't recommend anything. We recommended it for discussion.
Supervisor Jurdy?
I think we should tread really lightly in this area. I've supported no new cultivation rangelands. There may be some logic in allowing cultivation on portions of rangeland that have been in active management for traditional agriculture or other activities that are just as intensive as cannabis, but I think that would be, in my mind, a fairly narrow window. But I think before we proceed much further, I would like to be sure that appropriate staff from all departments, including the Treasurer's Office, were just part of a conversation about how any changes to this could perhaps affect people's promptness in paying the money that's already due for permits in rangeland.
Supervisor Haschak.
Yeah,
Oh,
I think,
Williams.
I don't know which speaker it was, but the point about putting cattle back on rangeland, the carbon footprint there and the cost to the environment, that's significant. On a 160-acre rangeland parcel, how many cannabis plants could you grow without being concerned about an environmental impact? I would think quite a few. And so I wouldn't support an outright ban. I think it should be proportional. It should protect wildlife. We should make sure that the oaks aren't impacted, but on a large parcel, a very small grow may be a way to maintain that land and avoid subdivision, which was the intent of the Williamson Act. I don't know that we're going to see livestock restored on our rangeland, or that it's a good idea.
Supervisor McCowan?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I think that we do have a tremendous amount of rangeland in the county. I think it's in excess of 1.7 million acres. And the interesting thing is you can, on your 160-acre parcel, you could have a 100-acre vineyard or more, and you could develop land not previously cultivated for that vineyard. So in looking at rangeland and the potential to allow new permits, and mindful of the environmental documents, and that I do believe that prohibition on, quote, new cultivation sites in rangeland was a mitigation, I think we could craft some narrow exceptions that could allow rangeland to be considered, and that would not have a significant environmental impact. So currently we have a prohibition on tree removal. We have a requirement of no Phase 3 permits before there is an oak woodland protection ordinance developed. We could further say that only areas we could say currently subject to intensive ag production, and we could define that it's actively in a vineyard or an orchard, some other type of production that clearly involved land disturbance and conversion from a natural state. We could direct staff to come back with objective criteria that would place strict limits that would ensure that there'd be no, new disturbance of habitat that isn't already occurring based on the current use. So it's kind of difficult for me to imagine how you're creating a significant environmental impact if you remove 10,000 square feet of grapevines and put in 10,000 square feet of cannabis. And the issue's been raised about water. Well, water is intensively scrutinized as part of the permitting process. There is a forbearance period that people can't use the water that they have a right to during the summer months. So I think this also would create more opportunities, for people who would like to relocate and don't currently have the option to do so. And it would also help allow for increased production, which I think is important in being able to properly brand Mendocino. So for all of those reasons, I would like to see us give direction to staff to research the implications, particularly related to our environmental documents, of potentially allowing new, quote, cultivation sites in rangeland. And in my world, this would also require a use permit, and it would, the beginning of it would coincide with the beginning of phase 3. So I think there'd be a lot of restrictions on it. And one further one, because frankly, the proliferation of hoop houses and greenhouses and all those kind of structures are, to me, an unintended consequence of how this is developed. I would have, I would be open to considering limitations or even prohibitions on greenhouses. So,
Supervisor Haschak.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I remember last fall when the board had this discussion and the sheriff and the district attorney came down and said they were very much against opening up rangeland because they weren't able to control what was going on right now. And I just think that we just accepted transferability, and the original intent was to get people to move into these more appropriate zoning areas such as agriculture. And I think that opening up rangeland at this point is presents environmental risk. I think it risks our CEQA document. I think that our staff are already overwhelmed. I think that the sheriff and DA are probably against it, even though they're not here today. And I just think we've had issues with trying to preserve the small mom and pop growers who are legacy growers in this county. And I think that we need to stay out of rangeland at this point.
I support you, Supervisor Haschak. Supervisor Williams?
Yeah, I mean, we started the meeting with liberty and justice for all. What I see is an erosion of the right to farm with the state's implementation of 64. And what about those ranchers that need supplemental income? They're hurting too. We're going to tell them they're on the wrong zoning no matter how much land they have. They can't have the same small garden that somebody on an RR10 could have. That doesn't set well with me.
But I think if they were previously cultivating, they can continue to.
Right, but they weren't because it wasn't legal. Now that it's a legal market, they want in on it. This county is depressed economy. And we're going to tell these people that they have an enormous piece of property. They're doing everything they can to farm it. And they can't add some cannabis. It doesn't seem right. Out of general fairness, I support Supervisor McCowan's ideas about the hoop houses, greenhouse restrictions, making sure we protect the environment, we protect the water, we do everything we can, but without an outright ban. Let them have a way to participate like everyone else.
So, well, it's 2-2 right now, but I don't know if we've heard from.
I supported it, but in a very limited fashion, where we were talking about just where rangeland or portions of rangeland are already in cultivation of some other traditional agriculture.
So we're kind of at a standoff here.
If I may, Madam Chair, I think we may have heard support from 3.
I don't think so.
Well, I think Supervisor Jurdy just said he would support limited consideration for areas already under cultivation.
Yeah, under traditional agriculture, yeah.
But that's much different than what Supervisor Williams is.
I think the three of us are aligned. We're not talking about promoting conversion of bare land. But where a rancher has already been utilizing the land for other farming activities, doesn't matter what's been planted there, but the soil has already been disturbed, we should allow cannabis in that space. So I think we could direct staff to find the most environmentally conscious, restrictive policy without an outright ban. And we're not passing it here today. We're just giving direction to attempt to find a solution to include some rangeland.
So Supervisor Jordy, does that?
Under those limited, well, I'm not sure if I want to expand it as far as, well, we'll see what staff says. I'm not sure I want to expand it as far as just like cattle grazing. I mean, I'm envisioning more it's inactive farming.
Yeah. So staff should, if I may, I would hope staff would take in mind that we're right on the edge. So don't push it too much. Try to include rangeland, but keep in mind that we barely have support for it. Is that fair?
Okay, one more bite at the apple, Supervisor McCowan.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and I'm envisioning something also more than simply grazing. That wouldn't qualify. You know, the land already has to have been converted from a natural state to a clearly intensive ag use, for example, a vineyard, an orchard. And I think Supervisor Williams made the point that this opportunity, and first of all, there are people that weren't growing because it wasn't legal to do so.
And there were people, you're right, that owned the land,
So now,
but they also leased it out and had it going on in their property with a lease fee. And now it's become legal. They don't necessarily want people to know and apply for a permit on their land, so.
well, that may be true also, but there are also people who never grew.
I'm not
They
done.
didn't lease it out to grow. They didn't profit. Now that it's legal, they would like to have the opportunity. And so again, under limited exceptions, I think that's appropriate. It may actually help them retain their family farm in their family. And, you know, the board previously has made some exceptions. We have an apple orchard in Philo that has cabins in the orchard because that was a way to supplement their income and help retain ownership of the farm. So I do think we have three in alignment, and I would ask, well, we might ask staff, do they feel they have sufficient direction?
If I may, through the chair, I can provide a direction that I believe we've captured and have you provide sort of further instruction. So as captured, staff would receive direction to create a use permit for rangeland zone parcels in which a row or field crop, vineyard, or orchard has previously taken place after the creation of an oak woodlands ordinance, excuse me.
And not prior to the commencement of phase 3.
Correct, a phase 3.
All right, on to permit size.
If I may, through the chair, just one
Yes,
thing
sir.
to add on to that. Deputy County Counsel Matthew Kudrowski. I want to echo something I believe Supervisor Williams said, which is this is just direction for staff to investigate and bring back to the board potentials that may occur here. Now, wrapping this, part of the reason, in talking with the ad hoc, I advised to bring forward some discussion was because if we're going to bring forward use permits for phase 3, I kind of wanted to see whatever else might be expanded or not expanded as part of that review. So we're all doing it as part of the same CEQA process, and we're all thinking about those things at the same time. So not just for this item, but everything we've been talking about before and afterwards, the staff is taking this direction, and if it sees, as it starts writing these things, and has any issues or questions from the board or concerns, we'll come back to the board on that. So for this rangeland issue and anything else, we will devise what we can and bring back to the board for further discussion.
So I have a question for staff. I may have misheard the chair, but it sounded like there may be a higher likelihood that on rangeland you might have people who are leasing land from the actual property owner. And I guess I just want to make sure that it seems logical, maybe it's already in our ordinance, that when someone seeks a permit, if they're not the landowner, are they showing some evidence that the landowner is approving of the cultivation or permit?
If I may, through the chair, Sean Connell, Cannabis Program Manager. Yes, Supervisor, when they apply, if they don't own the land, they are required to submit a property owner consent, which authorizes them to utilize that land for cultivation purposes, and we are in receipt of those.
Okay. Permit size. So the ad hoc recommends the board discuss the issue of allowing an increase in permit size. Supervisor Williams?
Question through the chair. Question for staff. What is the minimum size for an industrial hemp grow? I know we've banned it, but what's that? It was raised at a previous meeting. I believe it's somewhere. Is it 100 acres?
Sean Connell, Cannabis Program Manager. Yeah. I think Deputy County Counsel Kudrowski is going to...
He's going to Google it for us. So I think that we should, this is a statewide market. Soon it'll be a national market, maybe a global market later. And the idea that we're limiting to 10,000 square feet to avoid too much supply on the market, I think, is not taking into account that our farmers are competing against farmers in the rest of the state. In Santa Barbara, where they have 18-acre grows, is commonplace. So I would support a significant increase. I don't support putting a limit on it. If you want to limit, make it the same as grapes or an industrial hemp or something that uses equal amount of water, but artificially trying to keep it low. The county is getting 2.5% gross receipts on these folks, whatever they farm. Why are we limiting how much they produce?
Supervisor Haschak.
Yes, the ad hoc didn't come up with a recommendation on this because we were divided. And my position is that I think we want to support our small mom and pops, and they've had a rough time so far getting licensed, going through this permit process. It's tough out there. And I think that if we open it up to larger scale, we're going to change the nature of our communities. We're going to put a lot of people who are small farmers out of business, and I think that it's not a direction that I want to go.
Supervisor McCown?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So the county ordinance from inception was geared towards trying to, if you will, protect the small farmer, give them an opportunity to get established before we were to open it up to new cultivators. I agree with Supervisor Williams. This isn't a Mendocino County market, it's a statewide market, and an earlier speaker I thought provided a very logical statement regarding the need to have enough product from Mendocino County to be able to brand Mendocino County and to claim shelf space in dispensaries, and that by doing so, we actually help the small farmer, because then when they hear, oh, you're in Mendo, it means something to them. And if we don't have enough production to help create that brand, we're not going to be on the shelf, we're not going to be on people's minds, and everybody in Mendocino County will be disadvantaged. In terms of changing the culture of Mendocino County, that may have already occurred. We know there are probably thousands of cultivators that are not coming forward for a permit. They're either trying to continue flying below the radar, or they've quit cultivating because of the cost and complexity of compliance. So I think we have to allow an option that will wind up employing quite a few of those people who have expertise, but they don't have a suitable site, they don't have the capital. And if someone is scaling up, if we allow for scaling up, they're going to have employees, they're going to want to have knowledgeable employees. When Supervisor Haschak and I were meeting with some cultivators in relation to developing these recommendations, some cultivators actually, I think we heard their average pay was $25 to $35 an hour. And that's partly because they actually believe in paying a living wage. They also are paying for responsible employees who will show up and perform their tasks and who have the knowledge to do so and who they trust to be on their property. So, you know, the ability to allow for increased production will help some people who've been displaced out of the industry to still make a living participating in it. And again, this could be subject to a use permit and other conditions to limit the perceived impacts.
Supervisor Jurdy?
I generally agree with the comments of Supervisor McCowan on this, but I'm not clear based on this paragraph in what zoning districts are we talking about, and that to me is the essential part. That I'll reveal the hand of our economic committee. We've looked at this idea as well, but we've looked at it as perhaps rather than applying it to an existing zoning district, perhaps an overlay of a commercial cannabis cultivation or commercial cannabis enterprise zone, therefore limiting the footprint of it. And it could be applied to, you know, a handful of industrial properties, a handful of agricultural parcels that have access to water and infrastructure. So that's what we've been looking at. So, and under those circumstances, I would definitely support it. But I am a little nervous about how this could be applied to our general zoning ordinance because of the number of parcels that could potentially be affected by this. But I totally agree with what you said, that we've spent 4 years developing a small cultivator ordinance in Mendocino County. We allow less cultivation than is allowed in Humboldt on parcels. We should find the appropriate parcels in the county where we would allow larger aggregation of cultivators. Perhaps it's a collective of multiple cultivators on one site, or a series of sites that are together, again with appropriate infrastructure. But anyway, I think we're all heading, well, it sounds like we're largely heading in the same direction. It's just a matter of fine-tuning how we get there.
Supervisor Williams?
Yeah, I think the southern tip of the Emerald Triangle should not be so restricted in comparison to Santa Barbara, right? I mean, we want to support the small farmers. The way to do that is have a few larger entities on ag land that we can tax, right, and subsidize all of the small farmers who are hitting minimum tax and state fees. Let's give it to them for free and charge the 10-acre grows to make up for it.
Okay, I would allow staff
Madam
to...
Chair,
Yes.
if I could address the board, can I recommend on this one that staff come back with some recommendations on how to maybe look at this one, you know, in the future? You know, it is a complex issue, I think, supervisors, that you're discussing about. But I do think if we could just sit down with the staff, look at all the zones, and not just this enterprise zone idea, but other ones, and come back with some recommendations to you. I'd really suggest you give me direction to do something like that, and I'll work with our canvas manager, our chief planner, and we'll give you some good ideas of where you could take it if you want.
Supervisor McCowan?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, I'm open to good ideas, but you know, I'd like to give a little specific direction today, and I'm in agreement with most of what Supervisor Jurdy has said. So we may be each in agreement with 90% of what each has said. We're just not sure what the 10% is. But I support the idea of having certain areas that could be designated as cannabis enterprise zones where there is an allowance for greater production. And again, it'd be by a use permit. There'd be public hearings to establish these zones. You know, I don't know if we might ask staff to recommend areas, or it may work just as well.
Well, that's what they're suggesting.
Excuse me, we might ask, not exactly, we might ask people to apply to establish zones. But also, I could see allowing up to 1 acre in those zones where we currently allow. Maybe there needs to be a minimum parcel size. Maybe it's limited to ag. Certainly ag, if they have water, why couldn't they go to 1 acre? And then beyond that, I would consider even greater levels of production if we identify a particular zone. So I don't know if we're getting closer to 3, but.
Supervisor Williams?
I would agree with what you said, and if I could augment it, I think the direction we should give to our planning director is to come up with a policy that will create more of these $25 to $35 per hour jobs, allow us to proportion more of the cost of the cannabis program to a larger entity so that we can go easy on the folks who are struggling at the small end, and make sure it incorporates maintaining the land use in our county. We don't want to see 100-acre grows out on rangeland, but maybe we could see 10-acre grows on ag land, something comparable to Santa Barbara. Is that fair?
I think I'm closer to what Supervisor McCown just said.
At being 1 acre?
Beyond that, in a defined cannabis enterprise zone.
So why is it that you can grow 100 acres of grapes, but you can't do 10 acres of cannabis without a zone? We don't create zones for grape production. It's a plant. And it seems like we're carrying the criminal activity model of the past into present day. This is just a species of plant.
Supervisor Haschek.
I'm going to go back to the small is beautiful mantra. And, I can see where we could go to some bigger size, maybe up to 1 acre, on these industrial enterprise, cannabis enterprise zones. But I'd really like to see us promote the cooperative model and have some place where the small growers can come together and do, economic enterprise in a cooperative way. And I think that if we open it up just to anything, we're going to be inundated with the multinational corporations taking over, and we'll lose our niche.
And I just have to state that Supervisor Williams, McCowan, and Jurdy are going to have to work this one out because I stand with Supervisor Haschek. So it's a 3-2.
Well, I could support Supervisor Haschek's idea of, as we scale up and we see 10, 20-acre grows, that it be cooperatives that are owned within the county rather than out-of-area corporations coming in. If there's a way to direct staff to work on a policy that would let collectives come together and use ag land efficiently and scale up, I think that's the best of all.
The chair's not going any further on this. We have to have 3 of you come together with precise language to staff. Because you're not agreeing.
Well, yeah, and I just reiterate, I support the language that Supervisor McCown came up with. So that's 2.
I'll give you a 3rd.
So Supervisor McCowan, it was whether long. Can you repeat it in a much shorter version?
That staff return with recommendations for allowing an increase in permit size up to 1 acre for specific zones based on, I don't know, I think staff has heard the discussion. Maybe that's enough for that point. And that further, staff consider allowing in excess of 1 acre, specifically for cannabis enterprise zones or cooperatives. And I think this discussion will be continued and will be further informed when the cannabis economic development ad hoc reports out.
Yeah, that was pretty precise. Did you get that? Okay. Did y'all get it? Okay. Ms. Angelo?
Thank you, Chair Brown, and thank you, Supervisor Jordy, for saying that. I would just like to do a time check, Chair Brown, because we do have a closed session scheduled. We only have one item on, and if we're not going to go to closed session, I would like to send that staff home. If we still plan on going to closed session, there's no problem.
It appears that might be a matter that we could take up next Tuesday?
That would be absolutely fine. I
So
just didn't
then-
want to have staff remain if we weren't ever getting to closed session.
I agree, and I was going to get over this conversation because I was just looking at it myself.
Yeah, okay, then if it's okay with you, then the staff that we're going to be in closed session, I will go ahead and send them home and we'll schedule for next week.
Absolutely.
All right, thank you.
For the morning of next week,
Yes, thank you.
because we don't have a lot of business so far.
I don't know.
It's getting bigger.
I don't know that we're going to finish this today. I'm not hopeful. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Okay, let's try. All righty. So we got that on permit size. Moving forward, ad hoc recommendations for further research, cooperatives. Direct staff to further research the issue and recommend steps needed to support development of cooperatives. I think we all agree to that. Permits for, or permits per entity. Could you explain this a little bit, ad hoc?
Well, yes, Madam Chair. So there's been a number of different models, some of which we're not necessarily fully aware of exactly how they operate, where let's call it a parent entity comes in and forms relationships with existing cultivators who are in our permitting system, and then some of these cultivators themselves may actually form an entity of a type. And the question is, at what point do they become the same entity and therefore may cross over the limitation on only 2 permits per entity? And it's, on one level, it's a matter of interpretation of potentially some pretty arcane legal points. And I think thus far staff has been pretty reasonable in the way they have interpreted these conditions. Also, Supervisor Haschek and I have met with a couple of entities that have associations with multiple cultivators, and based on their description of their model, although they do have a contractual relationship, they're purchasing the product that someone produces, they might even be making a guaranteed payment against the ultimate production. They are maintaining that separation where it's not an employer-employee relationship. So they are separate entities. Potentially, there's other models out there where that line gets further obscured. And yet, I'm becoming open-minded to the idea, and particularly you start looking at a cooperative and exactly how it might be formed. You know, you might have a situation where the way for a legacy cultivator to be able to survive is to be aligned with other cultivators or with, you know, a corporation. And if that's the pathway for current legacy cultivators who have the knowledge, who have the experience to be able to continue and succeed, I would be open-minded to considering that, even if it meant an amendment to the ordinance. But I think we're not quite there yet. I think we can trust staff to continue to apply the ordinance in a reasonable way, while perhaps staff and the ad hoc do further research on is an ordinance amendment appropriate or not.
Supervisor Williams?
Why do we only allow a limited number of permits?
Well, that...
Because to me, it's kind of like we're trying to encourage economic development, and this is one example where we're trying to stifle it and say, no, we don't want you to produce more. To me, it's like telling Ross Liberty there's a quota on how many mufflers he can produce before he has to stop for the month, right? 1,000, and that's it. Why are we limiting it to 2? I hear cultivators say they have two permits and they want to have a nursery, and that requires another, and they can't do it. Why?
Well, I think Mr. Liberty is only going to make as many mufflers as he has a contract for.
Right, but that's exactly the model we want. We want the cultivators to produce as much as they can market, right? But we don't want to artificially limit the number of permits they can hold. That doesn't benefit the county or the cultivator.
Supervisor McCowan?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, again, the initial premise of the ordinance was to intentionally favor the legacy cultivator, the proverbial small farmer, and this was intended to prevent a large corporation from coming in and, dominating the market. So that was the intention behind it, and I think, as I've indicated, it's an evolving discussion, but there's a number of things that were done in what you could call an arbitrary fashion to try and give the small guy a chance, or gal.
Okay, we got to get some direction here. Supervisor Williams?
Yeah, I would suggest that we increase the permits from 2 to 5. Essentially, give the nursery to the existing cultivators. That'll be one of their additional permits.
Upon clarification with staff, I believe that example is already available, that someone can have a multi-permit that allows for 2 types of cultivation. In addition, they can have a nursery permit.
If I may, through the chair, Sean Connell, Cannabis Program Manager, we do authorize for people to separate their cultivation style. We do cap the amount of, the size that they can grow. So you could have a smaller indoor and an outdoor under a multi-type with an additional nursery.
Is there, through the chair, for staff, is there any drawback in allowing more permits per entity?
I think that we're looking to develop that and to research that and to see where that would play out.
So what I would propose is that we direct staff to research the appropriate permit count so that it benefits the small farms and not out-of-area corporations that may come in as a result of the increase.
You got fish swimming both ways on that one.
Well, it's a trade-off, right? You increase it too much, and it may be that we get competition we don't want, but you keep it at 2, and you're stifling our own cultivators. Yeah. So I would leave it to staff to research.
Hasek.
Thank you, Madam Chair. When I was on the campaign trail last year, that a lot of the stories I heard were the horror stories coming out of Santa Barbara and those places of people stacking these permits. And that's what people did not want, that they wanted the state to uphold the limit on permits. And I think that if we go to increasing the number of permits, we're going down the wrong road.
Okay, we need some conclusion here. Supervisor McCowan?
Well, again, I think we've put it out there that this is something that requires further research to better understand some of the models out there. And there may be models where this is appropriate. Maybe this is something that becomes applicable in enterprise zones or via collectives.
Supervisor Hasek.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I agree with Supervisor McCowan, and I think that we could research this and find, what the business entities are really looking for, but we have a frame of mind that we need to keep in consideration. Thank you.
Supervisor Jurdy.
I support the scope of the work that the ad hoc is already researching.
Okay, I do too. Supervisor Williams.
If the chair would allow me, I'd like to jump back up to an item that we covered earlier. It's been simmering for me under previous board direction, the generators. An idea I had is maybe we should reduce the fees for these generators. I would argue reduce it to zero. I'm far more concerned that county inspectors help with fire safety on generators that may be left unattended at grow sites than any sort of cost recovery we're going to get from the permits.
Supervisor McCowan.
Well, if the intent is to assure that their generator is going to be inspected for safety, is that the intent?
That's the intent, not the generator so much, but the overall installation, right? How far is it from dry grass?
Well, if they have applied for a permit through our system, I'm pretty sure they're going to get inspected and all those issues will be reviewed.
If I may, through the chair, Sean Connell, Cannabis Program Manager, I think that we're talking about a building permit requirement for a mechanical apparatus versus a cultivation permit where their cultivation activities incorporate mechanical practices. And so those would be different things because we as the cannabis program, we do not have a permit for generators.
Yeah, but if there's a generator on site, doesn't that get referred to planning and building? Okay, so that's a glitch that needs to be corrected. You know, it's kind of incomprehensible to me that we don't care about their source of power and whether it's legally permitted.
What's that? Regulation creep? So do the two of us just agree that generators are a concern and that there should be some direction? I would like to know that all of the generators, and my point was let's make it cheap or free so that we get as much participation as possible. One wildfire will cost us far more than the cost recovery we get off generator permits.
Okay, debate's on. Supervisor McCowan.
Well, there's a consultation going on among staff. Again, it's incomprehensible to me that I'm applying for a cultivation permit and nobody wants to know where am I dumping my waste oil from my generator? Or is it, or am I operating it under safe conditions?
I wanted to
Of
recognize.
course, go ahead.
Siobhan Holmes, Planning and Building
Sorry,
Services.
Siobhan, I didn't see you because of this.
That's okay. I just wanted to circle back around to make sure we were catching the discussion and all of the points. I'm sorry, did we move away from permits per entity back to generators? Okay, so what was the final direction? You'll have to pardon me, I missed what. So we're coming.
I've recorded that the staff is to research it further. There was no direction at that time other than for staff to research.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, if I may, Sean Connell, Cannabis Program Manager. What I was alluding to is that when you apply for a generator permit, it is done through our building department, and those reviews during plan check and on-site inspections are reviewed under the mechanical code and all forms of the California Building Code as adopted by this county, which does also provide Chapter 7A fire protections.
And if I may, Siobhan Holmes, Planning and Building Services. When it comes to generators in use during pre-permit site inspections, they are inspected and reviewed, and if required, the inspectors do send referrals to environmental health or planning. We simply haven't seen that many large generators that require additional reviews at this point.
Okay. Moving forward. Accommodation zones, setbacks, ad hoc. Supervisor McCowan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So in reviewing that issue, it did become apparent that if we reduced the setback from 1,000 to 600 feet, it would apply to a very limited number of applicants, and in most cases, they will require an administrative permit for other reasons, and that the reduced setback from the sensitive receptor can be included in the same administrative permit at no additional cost. So the ultimate recommendation was to stay with the 1,000-foot setback. Since then, we've also heard a request today to reduce the setback from an occupied dwelling on a neighboring parcel from 100 feet to 40 feet. If we did that, potentially that would limit the other need for administrative permits. But again, I think it would still apply to a very limited number of individuals. We might ask staff for their opinion on this. I think in the past, both when we were reviewing the ordinance for changes previously and throughout the ad hoc process, staff has been pretty clear on their position. So if you will, perhaps we could hear from staff on that issue.
Chair, if I may.
Yes.
Jesse Davis, Senior Planner. So with regards to this question about accommodation zone setbacks for sensitive receptors, ultimately one point that I would like to make clear is that the date of effective action for this might occur after the implementation period is closed. July 1st is the current window for existing CA districts. That being said, if we were to make this change, it would have to go back to the Planning Commission as well as to be brought before this board again for final decision. That effective ordinance would then have another month to become effective. So ultimately, we would miss the deadline for the established CA district to apply within. My apologies. Staff requests that the recommendations to retain the current ordinance stand.
Supervisor Williams?
Supervisor McCowan, when you say it would, the change from 1,000 to 600 would not affect very many, is that very many in the current queue? Is that of the pending permits? Because I would think those who are in that range between, well, less than 1,000, between 600 and 1,000, probably wouldn't have applied because they would have seen that they didn't meet the requirement. And so I don't think we can say very many. I mean, I'm surprised that there are any in the queue that would run into this problem because they should have seen that.
I believe that staff reviewed the applicability of the 1,000 feet to gardens that are in the accommodation zone that potentially could come in that would be affected, not merely to those who had applied.
What, through the chair to staff, what was the method? Was it Google Earth, or how did you determine where potential cultivators currently are relative to these?
So, if I may, through the chair, it began by identifying the sensitive receptors themselves within those CA districts. Of those CA districts, only the Laytonville and Covilos cannabis accommodation districts included sensitive receptors that would require that the 1,000-foot setback be established. From there, it was then identifying very clearly through aerial imagery to see if a proof of prior cultivation could be identified. Again, that might not be the case, given that indoor cultivation could be the style of preferred cultivation. Again, it's a limited number, just given that within the Covelo accommodation district, that area is very narrow. Yeah. And furthermore, there is an administrative permit to reduce that setback. So cultivators who do find themselves in that situation, we do encourage them to come in. Staff has developed findings to address potential nuisances that would be created for that sensitive receptor, and we are very much so ready to review those applications if submitted.
So I would support staff recommendation as well.
Supervisor Hashut.
Yes, what is the deadline to apply if you're in an accommodation zone?
If I may, through the chair, Jesse Davis. Presently, the deadline for established cannabis accommodation districts is July 1.
And follow-up question, if I may. Yes. That I'm hearing that if we extended this deadline, that maybe more people would be applying. Is that your sense of things out there?
At this stage, it's hard for me to determine what the sort of intent of the cannabis accommodation district participants are. At this stage, there's a limited window for them to apply. Currently and presently, it's established at July 1st.
And what would be the the downside of extending the deadline?
Jesse Davis, if I may, through the chair. At this point, staff can further investigate those downsides, but ultimately, there's only a very limited number of applicants who this potentially would affect, and staff time would be disproportionately applied to create that pathway when one already exists through an administrative permit.
Thank you.
So, what's the recommendation that we all agree upon?
Staff recommendation?
Well, that issue of extending the application period was not a recommendation, but I do think we've heard one from staff.
Okay. I think I know I can agree. Can you? Can you, Supervisor?
Yep.
Supervisor Haschek?
I've heard requests, and I have a couple accommodation zones in my district, and so that's what I'm looking at, trying to see if we can get more people into the program.
If I may, Siobhan Holmes, Department of Planning and Building Services. Since our last outreach event for Cannabis Accommodation District specifically, we've seen 3 additional applications.
So even though I have a desire to see many more people in the program, if that's what they want, we have to be realistic with it too, and look at staff time and the opportunity that people have been given so far. So I'm willing to go with the staff on this.
Supervisor Jordy?
I actually thought that the ad hoc was recommending just retain the existing setbacks, so that's why I was supporting.
No.
Well,
It's
but
staff
also,
recommendation.
we've shifted over to the issue of potentially extending the deadline for application, and I'm willing to, haven't we? Did
No.
I
No.
lost my place. Okay.
We're getting tired. So, staff has a recommendation. Can we restate that, please, so the supervisor's here?
If I may, through the chair, Jesse Davis, the staff recommends that we retain the current ordinance requirements as stated.
And this is on the accommodation zone setbacks. I'm willing to go with the staff
Yeah, I
recommendation.
actually thought we'd settled that one 10 minutes ago.
No. Supervisor Haschek?
One other issue with the accommodation zones would be transferability. And does transferability apply to the accommodation zone? And my feeling is that it should, that here are these people who are permitted, and we could they should be able to transfer that.
Supervisor McCowan?
My thought is it should not, and our recommendation was transferability would not apply in sunset zones. And before they were accommodation zones, they were sunset zones. So they're residential neighborhoods. And I'd like to preserve the option that eventually they will become residential neighborhoods where anyone buying a house is doing so primarily to live in it and not to be a cannabis cultivator. So I don't support transferability for the accommodation zone. Eventually, I think we'll see an attrition where it'll go back to this is a nice neighborhood to live instead of this is an opportunity to move to Mendocino, buy a house in the accommodation zone, and grow cannabis.
Supervisor Williams?
I don't think anybody watching this process will want to do that, in all seriousness. I think I support Supervisor Haschek's, that it seems like a taking that if a community has gone through the process and they've decided to opt in and one of their cultivators needs to sell, they've invested potentially hundreds of thousands in infrastructure, it really locks them in. I guess I'd like to find some middle ground, like a use permit, so that it can be revoked. Certainly there will be some bad actors, neighborhoods will run into this. And I think the use permit model gives incentive to make sure that, you know, roads are maintained and there's no scent and there's no noise, because they know that when that use permit comes up for renewal, there will be a hearing. So I would support some sort of use permit model in the long term.
All right, we've got two supervisors agreeing, Supervisor McCowan, Supervisor Jurdy.
Well, I've already stated I don't
Okay, so you're
support-
opposed to transferability?
I'm opposed
Yeah.
to transferability in the accommodation zones, which were sunset zones.
Okay. Supervisor Jurdy?
I want to hold with the existing ordinance.
Okay, and so do I. Okay. So moving to medical recreational exemptions. Can the ad hoc just give us a summary? Supervisor Haschek?
Yeah, we had discussed this at length about outdoor grows versus, you know, and then the size of the plot versus the 6 plants. And we ultimately came up with retain the current limits on cultivation for personal use and medical and recreational.
Okay. And that is the 6 plants?
6
Or 100
plants
square
within-
feet.
Within
100
100 square feet, and then to be outdoors for personal use, it has to be 10 acres. And again, that's the current ordinance. It's been in place for a while, and there's so much volatility in the industry. I think it makes a lot of sense to just hold the line. Let's get a couple of years of experience of what's going on with the industry. And I would also say that I believe staff uniformly and strongly supported this recommendation.
Supervisor Williams?
I would support an increase. I think medical patients may find where they're juicing the plant that 6 plants really isn't enough. I mean, I think that's where this program started out, right? It was about medical use, and we've really scaled it back to the point that it may not facilitate that need. And I understand the concern about if we increase it, are we going to have people profiting? Is it strictly a profit motive? But I think when you weigh medical patients who really have a need, I'd rather favor some people making a profit who should be under the commercial program than those with medical need going without.
Okay, what we have then is pretty much I think a 2-2.
Well, Supervisor Haschek and I are recommending staying the course.
Okay.
And we're in alignment with staff on that.
I'm also in alignment. Supervisor
Yep,
Jurdy?
me too.
So it's a 4-1. All right, permits per parcel. I think we talked about that. So ad hoc, you want to discuss that, please? It's on page 3, very last item, retain the limit of 2 permits per legal parcel, except for current exceptions, and we discussed one of those. Cooperatives and cannabis enterprise zones. Supervisor Haschek.
Yeah, I think we've discussed it, and everyone understands what we're talking about, and
okay.
Hopefully that's it.
I support the ad hoc's recommendation.
I also, Supervisor McCowan.
And I think that is something that can be revisited if we move forward in considering either cannabis enterprise zones or collectives and how we might accommodate them, but for now, sticking with the 2 per parcel.
Okay. Now we're discussing tree removal.
I thought we were almost done.
Ha-ha.
Don't we have 2 more memos?
We do have a couple.
So if I may, Madam Chair, the first one to me was pretty simple. If they have remove trees to develop a cultivation site, but they do have other sites, the tree removal would render that one site ineligible. They could move forward with a permit for the other locations on their parcel. They might have to adjust their application.
Supervisor Williams?
If we could clean up the language slightly to have the same intent, but clarify that removing trees for defensible space or for road widening, for turnouts, does not fall under this, even if it's to allow access to cultivation. I think what Supervisor McCowan is getting at is we don't want to see the forest cleared to make room for growing a canopy of cannabis. But I'm okay with the road being maintained and widened in defensible space to get to the cultivation site, because ultimately there's a public safety concern. You're going to send firefighters out there, and if they've kept their road narrow because they can't take trees, that's putting first responders at risk.
Supervisor McCowan?
Allowance for defensible space, removing hazard trees, tree maintenance, that's already included in the ordinance, I believe. The other exception you cite could tie into question 4, and so maybe we can defer discussion of turnouts and road widening till we get to there.
Okay.
Okay. Guess I'm on the wrong memo. So, okay. I'll go to that one.
I'm wondering, should we be going to page 2 to the staff questions?
Yeah, it's what he just showed me. It's,
Chair Brown, is this the one dated 5/13 at 3:15 p.m.?
Correct.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, I should have said that.
Which is the same as the previous, except the ad hoc recommendations are in bullet point format, and it includes the 4th bullet point.
Okay, well, why don't you take us through that, Supervisor?
Okay, so the second question staff raised is there is a pre-existing 3-acre conversion permit on file with CAL FIRE. However, tree removal associated with that 3-acre conversion occurred after the May 4th, 2017 deadline. Does that render the cultivation site ineligible? And the recommendation of the ad hoc is yes, because the ordinance clearly provided no tree removal after May 4th, 2017. However, if they're cultivating in areas outside of the 3-acre area, those would be acceptable.
I can agree with ad hoc's recommendation. Supervisor Williams?
Yeah, I would agree. I'd certainly like at some point to define the trees. If we're talking about native trees, there's a lot more support from me. If it's white firs that are, about to rotting and ready to fall over, I'm okay with them being cleared.
I think they're listed on the front page,
Are they?
maybe.
Supervisor Jurdy?
I agree with the ad hoc committee's recommendation.
Okay. Appears that we all agree.
The next one, staff has raised the issue of if an application is denied due to tree removal, are future property owners rendered ineligible to cultivate on that site based on the inappropriate removal that already occurred. The ad hoc is recommending that, yes, if somebody removed trees inappropriately, that site is ineligible to future owners as well.
So we're talking about the 3rd bullet point.
Correct.
I have a question about that.
Supervisor?
So what is our data retention policy for these applications? Do you expect 10 years from now staff to dig through applications and find that a previous owner had applied and been denied based on the tree removal?
Siobhan Holmes, Department of Planning and Building Services. We are able to track that per application quite easily.
Based on the address?
based on the application, the APN, and the denial documentation itself. It
Okay.
goes through a pretty rigorous process.
Right? Everybody in agreement with the ad hoc? Move forward to the fourth.
So the question is, do non-cultivation activities that result in tree removal, such as potentially a requirement from CAL FIRE that a access be improved or created in order to access a site, does that render the site ineligible? The ad hoc is recommending yes, and there's competing examples here potentially. So one example that was cited to me, some of these cultivation sites may be accessed by an ATV trail up a steep grade. It would require extensive grading and tree removal to create a legal access to that cultivation site. That's not something I want to encourage. If, on the other hand, based on your comments, if you have a cultivation site in proximity to a residence, and as part of this process, CAL FIRE is coming in and saying, not merely to get to the cultivation site, but to get to the residence, you need to create a turnout, you need to widen the road. I think that's, it would be more defensible to consider an exception for that cultivation site, because it's part of making that residence legal also, would be my understanding. And this is kind of a new question. I would appreciate staff response to the question raised.
Siobhan Holmes, Planning and Building Services. Agreed. There are definitely cultivation sites where roadways, widening, or developments would benefit both domestic and commercial activities on the site. So that is a possibility that the road could be beneficial, as in get you to your house and also get you to your cultivation site. I also wanted to offer an additional example for the board to consider, the water source itself. If you installed a pond in 2016, you may be undergoing a number of inspections from the California State Water Board, and during that time with Fish and Wildlife on your property as well, you may have to do more work that would require you to remove trees. So again, our ordinance prevents certain locations from coming into compliance based off other agency requirements, because they're directly telling them they have to do this to be compliant. But it's a contradiction because our ordinance clearly says that they cannot. So not just roads to the cultivation site, but also roads to ponds, potentially roads to spring, points of diversions, where the actual water tanks are. So not just the house or the cultivation site.
Supervisor Williams.
I would just as soon leave it alone. I don't know that this is a real problem. I would think, what I hear is cultivators can't pay their few $1,000s minimum tax. I don't know how they're going to pay tens of thousands to put a road in. And so I just wonder, are we attacking a problem that we're actually facing? Do we have examples of where trees are being removed to put in new roadways to get to hilltop cultivation sites that were previously accessed by ATVs only?
Siobhan Holmes, Planning and Building Services, yes.
How many?
Well, right now we're tracking 12 that are sort of the...
And they're working on clearing trees to put a roadway in?
Correction, they illegally removed trees during Prohibition, and in doing so allowed for more roadways to be put in to access additional sites on the parcel.
So the roadways were put in when the price was higher because it was black market, and now they're trying to get into the legal market, and they're adding to their road network so that they can have additional sites?
Again, Siobhan Holmes from Planning and Building Services. I couldn't speak that specifically about each site. There is more than likely a representative of the scenario you just described in our applicant pool, though.
of currently putting in new roads, clearing trees. And is
Yes.
it just a few trees, or are we talking a mile of road?
As the ordinance, Siobhan Holmes, Planning and Building Services. As the ordinance reads right now, the removal of any trees on our list is prohibited.
Right. So I would support if we can find a compromise of significant road development where we're talking about removing, 100 trees to put in a half-mile of road. Yeah, we need to limit it. But if we're talking about somebody that was in the black market at $5,000 a pound, it made sense for them to put a roadway in, and now they're taking out a handful of trees. It just seems like too much noise. We're trying to cut down the amount of work the staff has to conduct as part of this program. Having them inspect trees and count trees and look at roadways just seems overboard.
Supervisor McCowan?
So the prohibition is on tree removal after May 4th, 2017. So if they remove them prior to that time, they're not automatically ineligible, correct? And then even if, let's see, so after May 4th, if they were removed prior to May 4th, and they can provide evidence that none were illegally removed. Anyway, trying to digest this a little bit, there's a restoration process that can go forward. So it looks like if they remove them unlawfully prior to May 4th, 2017, they have the option to remediate to the satisfaction of staff and/or the resource agencies. So there's an option for that illegal
Like a
removal to be
replanting.
corrected if it occurred prior to May 4th, 2017. If they removed them after that time, I don't have a lot of sympathy because they should have been aware, they should have been paying enough attention to know what they were doing. Again, so if staff could characterize how many of these 12 applications are the ATV trail up a steep grade versus how many are of these potential roads are providing access to a residence?
If I may, through the chair, Jesse Davis, senior planner. There are a myriad of examples, not just the roadway to the cultivation site, including the pond expansion as discussed, as well as encroachments onto public roads. The Department of Transportation may require that a tree be removed in order to identify the safest access to a public roadway. So while we use that example with regards to the narrow pathway up to the cultivation site as an example, this is essentially asking whether or not tree removal as required by a resource agency or another entity constitutes an illegal tree removal.
Well, and it clouds it, it'd be easier to just say, no tree removal, you're done. If that tree removal were required to provide safe sight distance at an interface with a public road, I'm willing to maybe be a little more lenient because it's a safety issue. Likewise, if it's to install a turnout or widen a road that goes to a residence, again, it's a public safety issue.
Supervisor Hashut?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, I think we got onto this from the CAL FIRE requiring, tree removal, and then we talked about these resource agencies requiring some tree removal. So the basic question we have to deal with is it allowable, right? Or does it, if they remove that tree to comply with the resource agency or CAL FIRE, then, we've got a problem there. We've got this contradiction. So I think that, does staff have a recommendation about how we could word that so that a person could comply with those agencies and not be excluded from getting a permit?
Siobhan Holmes, Department of Planning and Building Services. I think if staff was directed to create a policy that focused on fire and safety, we may be able to strike the balance that you're seeking.
Okay. Well, would it be good enough to give staff direction to come up with that and bring it back to the board at a future date?
As long as we all agree.
I'm in perfect accord.
Supervisor Williams?
I would agree to give it to staff to come back with something reasonable.
Supervisor Jordy?
And there's the rub, what's reasonable?
Well, if our concern is deforestation, I don't think we should be focused on 12 cannabis sites, right? I mean, what's going on in the forest is a serious matter, but this is not the problem. This is noise. And frankly, the idea of county staff spending time trying to figure out if trees were before this date or after this date for 12 applicants on hillside properties, to me, just seems like a waste of resources.
Sir?
Pretty important to
One-
that applicant.
One could say that, but then at the same time, we do have this ordinance, and we have people who have been complying with it and trying to not to remove trees. And if we're talking about going into rangeland or expanding grows, then we've got serious issues that we need to look at.
My final comment. For reasonableness, I would think the quantity of trees would come into play. Someone who's removed 100 trees to benefit a grow site, yeah, that's our concern. Someone who just didn't like that oak that was leaning over the road and decided to take it without a permit, I don't think we want to hear about that. And so there must be some way to strike a balance as to the extent of the road network and the extent of the tree removal.
Gonna have a lot to do. And we were trying to lessen it so you could get the permits done. I do apologize. This one county supervisor does apologize. Okay. So, that's it on tree removal? Are we ready to sing? That just may be it. So that concludes that particular agenda item. So, clerk, I think that's it. Unless you want to do supervisors' reports.
Can we do them tomorrow, next Tuesday?
We've delayed them for 3 weeks. It's okay, it's okay. We're gonna move on and adjourning the meeting at 6:15.